Part. Chapter 3. Appendix. Chapter 1. A word for Lavengro. Shortly after the publication of the first 3 volumes of the present work, the author received various letters from individuals, in which he was requested to state what might be the drift and tendency of Lavengro. The author cannot help thinking it somewhat extraordinary, that, after a preface in which he was particularly careful to tell the public what the book was, and the object with which it was written, any fresh information with respect to it should be required of him. As, however, all the letters which he has received have been written in a friendly spirit, he will now endeavor to be a little more explicit than on a former occasion. Lavengro is the history up to a certain period of one of rather a peculiar mind and system of nerves, with an exterior shy and cold, under which lurk much curiosity, especially with regard to what is wild and extraordinary, a considerable quantity of energy and industry, and an unconquerable love of independence. It narrates his earliest dreams and feelings, dwells with minuteness on the ways, words, and characters of his father, mother and brother, lingers on the occasional resting places of his wandering half-military childhood, describes the gradual hardening of his bodily frame by robust exercises, his successive struggles, after his family and himself have settled down in a small local capital, to obtain knowledge of every kind, but more particularly philological lore. His visits to the tent of the Romany Chow, and the parlor of the Anglo-German philosopher. The effect produced upon his character by his flinging himself into contact with people all widely differing from each other, but all extraordinary. His reluctance to settle down to the ordinary pursuits of life, his struggles after moral truth, his glimpses of God and the obscuration of the divine being, to his mind's eye. And his being cast upon the world of London by the death of his father, at the age of 19. 346 in the world within a world, the world of London. It shows him playing his part for some time as he best can, in the capacity of a writer for reviews and magazines, and describes what he saw and underwent whilst laboring in that capacity. It represents him, however, as never forgetting that he is the son of a brave but poor gentleman, and that if he is a hack author, he is likewise a scholar. It shows him doing no dishonorable jobs, and proves that if he occasionally associates with low characters, he does so chiefly to gratify the curiosity of a scholar. In his conversations with the apple woman of London Bridge, the scholar is ever apparent, so again in his acquaintance with the man of the table. For the book is no raker-up of the uncleanness of London, and if it gives what at first sight appears refuse, it invariably shows that a pearl of some kind, generally a philological one, is contained amongst it. It shows its hero always accompanied by his love of independence, scorning in the greatest poverty to receive favors from anybody, and describes him finally rescuing himself from peculiarly miserable circumstances by writing a book, an original book, within a week, even as Johnson is said to have written his Rasselas, and Beckford his VIII, and tells how, leaving London, he betakes himself to the roads and fields. In the country it shows him leading a life of roving adventure, becoming tinker, gypsy, postilion, ostler, associating with various kinds of people, chiefly of the lower classes, whose ways and habits are described. But, though leading this erratic life, we gather from the book that his habits are neither vulgar nor vicious, that he still follows to a certain extent his favorite pursuits, hunting after strange characters, or analyzing strange words and names. At the conclusion of the 5th volume, which terminates the first part of the history, it hints that he is about to quit his native land on a grand philological expedition. Those who read this book with attention, and the author begs to observe that it would be of little utility to read it hurriedly, may derive much information with respect to matters of philology and literature. It will be found treating of most of the principal languages from Ireland to China, and of the literature which they contain. And it is particularly minute with regard to the ways, manners and speech of the English section of the most extraordinary and mysterious clan or tribe of people to be found in the whole world, the children of Roma. 347 But it contains matters of much more importance than anything in connection with philology, and the literature and manners of nations. Perhaps no work was ever offered to the public in which the kindness and providence of God have been set forth by more striking examples. Or the machinations of priestcraft been more truly and lucidly exposed, or the dangers which result to a nation when it abandons itself to effeminacy, and a rage for what is novel and fashionable, than the present. With respect to the kindness and providence of God, are they not exemplified in the case of the old apple woman and her son? These are beings in many points bad, but with warm affections, who, after an agonizing separation, are restored to each other. But not until the hearts of both are changed and purified by the influence of affliction. Are they not exemplified in the case of the rich gentleman, who touches objects in order to avert the evil chance? This being has great gifts and many amiable qualities, but does not everybody see that his besetting sin is selfishness? He fixes his mind on certain objects, and takes inordinate interest in them, because they are his own, and those very objects, through the providence of God, which is kindness in disguise, become snakes and scorpions to whip him. Tired of various pursuits, he at last becomes an author, and publishes a book, which is very much admired, and which he loves with his usual inordinate affection. The book, consequently becomes a viper to him, and at last he flings it aside and begins another. The book, however, is not flung aside by the world, who are benefited by it, deriving pleasure and knowledge from it, so the man who merely wrote to gratify self, has already done good to others, and got himself an honorable name. But God will not allow that man to put that book under his head and use it as a pillow. The book has become a viper to him, he has banished it, and is about another, which he finishes and gives to the world. It is a better book than the first, and everyone is delighted with it, but it proves to the writer a scorpion, because he loves it with inordinate affection. But it was good for the world that he produced this book, which stung him as a scorpion. Yes. And good for himself, for the labor of writing it amused him, and perhaps prevented him from dying of apoplexy. But the book is banished, and another is begun, and herein, again, is the providence of God manifested. The man has the power of producing still, and God determines that he shall give to the world what remains in his brain, which he would not do, had he been satisfied with the second work. He would have gone to sleep upon that as he would upon the first, for the man is selfish and lazy. In his account of what he suffered during the composition of this work, his besetting sin of selfishness is manifest enough. The work on which he is engaged occupies his every thought, it is his idol, his deity, it shall be all his own, he won't borrow a thought from anyone else, and he is so afraid lest, when he publishes it, that it should be thought that he had borrowed from anyone, that he is continually touching objects, his nervous system, owing to his extreme selfishness, having become partly deranged. He is left touching, in order to banish the evil chance from his book, his deity. No more of his history is given. But does the reader think that God will permit that man to go to sleep on his third book, however extraordinary it may be? Assuredly not. God will not allow that man to rest till he has cured him to a certain extent of his selfishness, which has, however, hitherto been very useful to the world. Then, again, in the tale of Peter Williams, is not the hand of Providence to be seen? This person commits a sin in his childhood, utters words of blasphemy, the remembrance of which, in after life, preying upon his imagination, unfits him for quiet pursuits, to which he seems to have been naturally inclined. But for the remembrance of that sin, he would have been Peter Williams, the quiet, respectable Welsh farmer, somewhat fond of reading the ancient literature of his country in winter evenings, after his work was done. God, however, was aware that there was something in Peter Williams to entitle him to assume a higher calling. He therefore permits this sin, which, though a childish affair, was yet a sin, and committed deliberately, to prey upon his mind till he becomes at last an instrument in the hand of God. A humble Paul, the great preacher, Peter Williams, who, though he considers himself a reprobate and a castaway, instead of having recourse to drinking in mad desperation, as many do who consider themselves reprobates, goes about Wales and England preaching the word of God, dilating on his power and majesty, and visiting the sick and afflicted. until God sees fit to restore to him his peace of mind. Which he does not do, however, until that mind is in a proper condition to receive peace, till it has been purified by the pain of the one idea which has so long been permitted to riot in his brain. Which pain, however, an angel, in the shape of a gentle, faithful wife, had occasionally alleviated. For God is merciful even in the blows which he bestoweth, and will not permit anyone to be tempted beyond the measure which he can support. And here it will be as well for the reader to ponder upon the means by which the Welsh preacher is relieved from his mental misery. He is not relieved by a text from the Bible, by the words of consolation and wisdom addressed to him by his angel-minded wife, nor by the preaching of one yet more eloquent than himself, but by a quotation made by Lavengro from the life of Mary Flanders, cutpurse and prostitute, which life Lavengro had been in the habit of reading at the stall of his old friend the apple woman on London Bridge, who had herself been very much addicted to the perusal of it, though without any profit whatever. Should the reader be dissatisfied with the manner in which Peter Williams is made to find relief, the author would wish to answer that the Almighty frequently accomplishes his purposes by means which appear very singular to the eyes of men, and at the same time to observe that the manner in which that relief is obtained is calculated to read a lesson to the proud, fanciful and squeamish, who are ever in a fidget lest they should be thought to mix with low society or to bestow a moment's attention on publications which are not what is called of a perfectly unobjectionable character. Had not Lavengro formed the acquaintance of the old apple woman on London Bridge, he would not have had an opportunity of reading the life of Mary Flanders, and, consequently, of storing in a memory, which never forgets anything, a passage which contained a balm for the agonized mind of poor Peter Williams. The best medicines are not always found in the finest shops. Suppose, for example, if, instead of going to London Bridge to read, he had gone to Albemarle Street, and had received from the proprietors of the literary establishment in that very fashionable street, permission to read the publications on the tables of the saloons there. Does the reader think he would have met any balm in those publications for the case of Peter Williams? Does the reader suppose that he would have found Mary Flanders there? He would certainly have found that highly unobjectionable publication Rasselas, and the Spectator, or lives of royal and illustrious personages, but, of a surety, no Mary Flanders. 348. So when Lavengro met with Peter Williams, he would have been unprovided with a balm to cure his ulcerated mind, and have parted from him in a way not quite so satisfactory as the manner in which he took his leave of him. For it is certain that he might have read Rasselas, and all the other unexceptionable works to be found in the library of Albemarle Street, over and over again, before he would have found any cure in them for the case of Peter Williams. Therefore the author requests the reader to drop any squeamish nonsense he may wish to utter about Mary Flanders, and the manner in which Peter Williams was cured. And now with respect to the old man who knew Chinese, but could not tell what was o'clock. This individual was a man whose natural powers would have been utterly buried and lost beneath a mountain of sloth and laziness had not God determined otherwise. He had in his early years chalked out for himself a plan of life in which he had his own ease and self-indulgence solely in view. He had no particular bad passions to gratify, he only wished to lead an easy, quiet life, just as if the business of this mighty world could be carried on by innocent people fond of ease and quiet, or that Providence would permit innocent, quiet drones to occupy any portion of the earth and to cumber it. God had at any rate decreed that this man should not cumber it as a drone. He brings a certain affliction upon him, the agony of which produces that terrible whirling of the brain which, unless it is stopped in time, produces madness. He suffers indescribable misery for a period, until one morning his attention is arrested, and his curiosity is aroused, by certain Chinese letters on a teapot. His curiosity increases more and more, and, of course, in proportion as his curiosity is increased with respect to the Chinese marks, the misery in his brain, produced by his mental affliction, decreases. He sets about learning Chinese, and after the lapse of many years, during which his mind subsides into a certain state of tranquility, He acquires sufficient knowledge of Chinese to be able to translate with ease the inscriptions to be found on its singular crockery. Yes, the laziest of human beings, through the providence of God, a being, too, of rather inferior capacity, acquires the written part of a language so difficult that, as Lavengro said on a former occasion, none but the cleverest people in Europe, the French, are able to acquire it. But God did not intend that man should merely acquire Chinese. He intended that he should be of use to his species, and by the instrumentality of the first Chinese inscription which he translates, the one which first arrested his curiosity, he is taught the duties of hospitality. Yes, by means of an inscription in the language of a people, who have scarcely an idea of hospitality themselves, God causes the slothful man to play a useful and beneficent part in the world, relieving distressed wanderers, and, amongst others, Lavengro himself. But a striking indication of the man's surprising sloth is still apparent in what he omits to do. He has learnt Chinese, the most difficult of languages, and he practices acts of hospitality, because he believes himself enjoined to do so by the Chinese inscription. But he cannot tell the hour of the day by the clock within his house. He can get on, he thinks, very well without being able to do so. Therefore, from this one omission, it is easy to come to a conclusion as to what a sluggard's part the man would have played in life, but for the dispensation of Providence. Nothing but extreme agony could have induced such a man to do anything useful. He still continues, with all he has acquired, with all his usefulness, and with all his innocence of character, without any proper sense of religion, though he has attained a rather advanced age. If it be observed, that this want of religion is a great defect in the story, the author begs leave to observe that he cannot help it. Lavengro relates the lives of people so far as they were placed before him, but no further. It was certainly a great defect in so good a man to be without religion. It was likewise a great defect in so learned a man not to be able to tell what was o'clock. It is probable that God, in his loving kindness, will not permit that man to go out of the world without religion. Who knows but some powerful minister of the Church, full of zeal for the glory of God, will illume that man's dark mind. Perhaps some clergyman will come to the parish who will visit him and teach him his duty to his God. Yes, it is very probable that such a man, before he dies, will have been made to love his God. Whether he will ever learn to know what's o'clock, is another matter. It is probable that he will go out of the world without knowing what's o'clock. It is not so necessary to be able to tell the time of day by the clock as to know one's God through his inspired word. A man cannot get to heaven without religion, but a man can get there very comfortably without knowing what's o'clock. But, above all, the care and providence of God are manifested in the case of Lavengro himself, by the manner in which he is enabled to make his way in the world up to a certain period, without falling a prey either to vice or poverty. In his history, there is a wonderful illustration of part of the text, quoted by his mother, "I have been young, but now am old, yet never saw I the righteous forsaken, or his seed begging bread." He is the son of good and honorable parents, but at the critical period of life, that of entering into the world, he finds himself without any earthly friend to help him. Yet he manages to make his way. He does not become a captain in the Life Guards, it is true, nor does he get into Parliament, nor does the last volume conclude in the most satisfactory and unobjectionable manner. By his marrying a dowager countess, as that wise man Addison did, or by his settling down as a great country gentleman, perfectly happy and contented, like the very moral Roderick Random, or the equally estimable Peregrine Pickle. He is hack author, gypsy, tinker and postilion, yet, upon the whole, he seems to be quite as happy as the younger sons of most earls, to have as high feelings of honor. And when the reader loses sight of him, he has money in his pocket honestly acquired, to enable him to commence a journey quite as laudable as those which the younger sons of earls generally undertake. Surely all this is a manifestation of the kindness and providence of God, and yet he is not a religious person. Up to the time when the reader loses sight of him, he is decidedly not a religious person. He has glimpses, it is true, of that God who does not forsake him, but he prays very seldom, is not fond of going to church. And, though he admires Tate and Brady's version of the Psalms, his admiration is rather caused by the beautiful poetry which that version contains than the religion. Yet his tale is not finished, like the tale of the gentleman who touched objects, and that of the old man who knew Chinese without knowing what was a clock. Perhaps, like them, he is destined to become religious, and to have, instead of occasional glimpses, frequent and distinct views of his God. Yet, though he may become religious, it is hardly to be expected that he will become a very precise and straight-laced person. It is probable that he will retain, with his scholarship, something of his gypsyism, his predilection for the hammer and tongs, and perhaps some inclination to put on certain gloves, not white kid. With any friend who may be inclined for a little old English diversion, and a readiness to take a glass of ale, with plenty of malt in it. And as little hop as may well be, ale at least 2 years old, with the aforesaid friend, when the diversion is over. For, as it is the belief of the writer that a person may get to heaven very comfortably without knowing what's a clock, so it is his belief that he will not be refused admission there. Because to the last he has been fond of healthy and invigorating exercises, and felt a willingness to partake of any of the good things which it pleases the Almighty to put within the reach of his children during their sojourn upon earth. Chapter 2. On Priestcraft. The writer will now say a few words about priestcraft, and the machinations of Rome, and will afterward say something about himself, and his motives for writing against them. With respect to Rome, and her machinations, much valuable information can be obtained from particular parts of Lavengro, and its sequel. Shortly before the time when the hero of the book is launched into the world, the popish agitation in England had commenced. The popish propaganda had determined to make a grand attempt on England. Popish priests were scattered over the land, doing the best they could to make converts to the old superstition. With the plans of Rome, and her hopes, and the reasons on which those hopes are grounded, the hero of the book becomes acquainted, during an expedition which he makes into the country. From certain conversations which he holds with a priest in a dingle, in which the hero had taken up his residence. He likewise learns from the same person much of the secret history of the Roman See, and many matters connected with the origin and progress of the popish superstition. The individual with whom he holds these conversations is a learned, intelligent, but highly unprincipled person, of a character however very common amongst the priests of Rome, who in general are people void of all religion, and who, notwithstanding they are tied to Rome by a band which they have neither the power nor wish to break, turn her and her practices over their cups with their confidential associates, to a ridicule only exceeded by that to which they turn those who become the dupes of their mistress and themselves. It is now necessary that the writer should say something with respect to himself, and his motives for waging war against Rome. First of all, with respect to himself, he wishes to state, that to the very last moment of his life, he will do and say all that in his power may be to hold up to contempt and execration the priestcraft and practices of Rome. There is, perhaps, no person better acquainted than himself, not even among the choicest spirits of the priesthood, with the origin and history of popery. From what he saw and heard of popery in England, at a very early period of his life, his curiosity was aroused, and he spared himself no trouble either by travel or study to make himself well acquainted with it in all its phases, the result being a hatred of it, which he hopes and trusts he shall retain till the moment when his spirit quits the body. Popery is the great lie of the world, a source from which more misery and social degradation have flowed upon the human race, than from all the other sources from which those evils come. It is the oldest of all superstitions. And though in Europe it assumes the name of Christianity, it existed and flourished amidst the Himalayan hills at least 2,000 years before the real Christ was born in Bethlehem of Judea. In a word, it is Buddhism. And let those who may be disposed to doubt this assertion, compare the popery of Rome, and the superstitious practices of its followers, with the doings of the priests who surround the Grand Lama. And the mouthings, bellowing, turnings round, and, above all, the penances of the followers of Buddha with those of Roman devotees. But he is not going to dwell here on this point. It is dwelt upon at tolerable length in the text, and has likewise been handled with extraordinary power by the pen of the gifted but irreligious Volney. Moreover, the elite of the Roman priesthood are perfectly well aware that their system is nothing but Buddhism under a slight disguise. And the European world in general has entertained for some time past an inkling of the fact. And now a few words with respect to the motives of the writer for expressing a hatred for Rome. This expressed abhorrence of the author for Rome might be entitled to little regard, provided it were possible to attribute it to any self-interested motive. There have been professed enemies of Rome, or of this or that system, but their professed enmity may frequently be traced to some cause which does them little credit. But the writer of these lines has no motive, and can have no motive, for his enmity to Rome, save the abhorrence of an honest heart for what is false, base, and cruel. A certain clergyman wrote with much heat against the Papists in the time of 349, who was known to favor the Papists, but was not expected to continue long in office. And whose supposed successor, 350, the person, indeed, who did succeed him, was thought to be hostile to the Papists. This divine, who obtained a rich benefice from the successor of 351, who during 352 time had always opposed him in everything he proposed to do, and who, of course, during that time affected to be very inimical to popery, this divine might well be suspected of having a motive equally creditable for writing against the Papists, as that which induced him to write for them, as soon as his patron, who eventually did something more for him, 353, had espoused their cause. But what motive, save an honest one, can the present writer have, for expressing an abhorrence of popery? He is no clergyman, and consequently can expect neither benefices nor bishoprics, supposing it were the fashion of the present, or likely to be the fashion of any future administration to reward clergymen with benefices or bishoprics, who, in the defense of the religion of their country write, or shall write, against popery, and not to reward those who write, or shall write, in favor of it, and all its nonsense and abominations. But if not a clergyman, he is the servant of a certain society which has the overthrow of popery in view, and therefore, etc. This assertion, which has been frequently made, is incorrect, even as those who have made it probably knew it to be. He is the servant of no society whatever. He eats his own bread, 354, and is one of the very few men in England who are independent in every sense of the word. It is true he went to Spain with the colors of that society on his hat. Oh, the blood glows in his veins. Oh, the marrow awakes in his old bones when he thinks of what he accomplished in Spain in the cause of religion and civilization with the colors of that society in his hat, and its weapon in his hand. Even the sword of the Word of God. How with that weapon he hewed left and right, making the priests fly before him, and run away squeaking, via que demonio es este. 355 and when he thinks of the plenty of Bible swords which he left behind him, destined to prove, and which have already proved, pretty calthrops in the heels of popery. Halloo! Batushka, he exclaimed the other night on reading an article in a newspaper, 356, what do you think of the present doings in Spain? Your old friend the Zingaro, the Gitano who wrote about Spain, to say nothing of Galicia, with the Greek Buccini behind him as his squire, had a hand in bringing them about. There are many brave Spaniards connected with the present movement 357 who took Bibles from his hands, and read them and profited by them, learning from the inspired page the duties of one man towards another, and the real value of a priesthood and their head, who set at naught the word of God, and think only of their own temporal interests. Aye, and who learn Gitano, their own Gitano, from the lips of the London Caloro, and also songs in the said Gitano. Very fit to dumbfounder your semi-Buddhist priests when they attempt to bewilder people's minds with their school logic and pseudo-ecclesiastical nonsense. Songs such as Un Arajai, Sinaba Chabando Un Sermon 358. But with that society he has long since ceased to have any connection. He bade it adieu with feelings of love and admiration more than 14 years ago, so in continuing to assault popery, no hopes of interest founded on that society can sway his mind. Interest, who, with worldly interest in view, would ever have anything to do with that society? It is poor and supported, like its founder Christ, by poor people. And so far from having political influence, it is in such disfavor, and has ever been, with the dastardly great, to whom the government of England has for many years past been confided, that the having borne its colours only for a month would be sufficient to exclude any man, whatever his talents, his learning, or his courage may be, from the slightest chance of being permitted to serve his country either for fee or without. A fellow who unites in himself the bankrupt trader, the broken author, or rather bookmaker, and the laugh-down single-speech spooter of the House of Commons, may look forward, always supposing that at one time he has been a foaming radical, to the government of an important colony. An ancient fox who has lost his tail may, provided he has a score of radical friends, who will swear that he can bark Chinese, though Chinese is not barked but sung, be forced upon a Chinese colony, though it is well known that to have lost one's tail, is considered by the Chinese in general as an irreparable infamy, whilst to have been once connected with a certain society, to which, to its honour be it said, all the radical party are vehemently hostile, would be quite sufficient to keep anyone not only from a government, but something much less, even though he could translate the rhymed sessions of Hariri 359 and reversed, still retaining his tail, in the two languages 360 in which Qianlong wrote his eulogium on Mukden, that piece which, translated by Amiot, the learned Jesuit, won the applause of the celebrated Voltaire. No. Were the author influenced by hopes of fee or reward, he would, instead of writing against popery, write for it. All the trumpery titled, he will not call them great again, would then be for him, and their masters the radicals, with their hosts of newspapers, would be for him. More especially if he would commence maligning the society whose colours he had once on his hat, a society which, as the priest says in the text, is one of the very few Protestant institutions for which the Popish Church entertains any fear, and consequently respect, as it respects nothing which it does not fear. The writer said that certain rulers would never forgive him for having been connected with that society. He went perhaps too far in saying never. It is probable that they would take him into favor on one condition, which is, that he should turn his pen and his voice against that society. Such a mark of a better way of thinking would perhaps induce them to give him a government nearly as good as that which they gave to a certain ancient radical fox at the intercession of his radical friends, who were bound to keep him from the pauper's kennel, after he had promised to foam, bark and snarl at corruption no more. He might even entertain hopes of succeeding, nay, of superseding, the ancient creature in his government, but even were he as badly off as he is well off, he would do no such thing. He would rather exist on crusts and water, he has often done so, and been happy. Nay, he would rather starve than be a rogue, for even the feeling of starvation is happiness compared with what he feels who knows himself to be a rogue, provided he has any feeling at all. What is the use of a mitre or knighthood to a man who has betrayed his principles? What is the use of a gilt collar, nay, even of a pair of scarlet breeches, to a fox who has lost his tail? Oh! The horror which haunts the mind of the fox who has lost his tail, and with reason, for his very mate loathes him, and more especially if, like himself, she has lost her brush. Oh! The horror which haunts the mind of the two-legged rogue who has parted with his principles, or those which he professed, for what? We'll suppose a government. What's the use of a government, if, the next day after you have received it, you are obliged for very shame to scurry off to it with the hoot of every honest man sounding in your ears? Lightly Liar leaped and away ran. Piers Plowman. But bigotry, it has been said, makes the author write against popery. And thoroughgoing bigotry, indeed, will make a person say or do anything. But the writer is a very pretty bigot truly. Where will the public find traces of bigotry in anything he has written? He has written against Rome with all his heart, with all his mind, with all his soul, and with all his strength. But as a person may be quite honest, and speak and write against Rome, in like manner he may speak and write against her, and be quite free from bigotry. Though it is impossible for anyone but a bigot or a bad man to write or speak in her praise, her doctrines, actions and machinations being what they are. Bigotry. The author was born, and has always continued, in the wrong church for bigotry, the quiet, unpretending Church of England. A church which, had it been a bigoted church, and not long suffering almost to a fault, might with its opportunities, as the priest says in the text, have stood in a very different position from that which it occupies at present. No. Let those who are in search of bigotry, seek for it in a church very different from the inoffensive Church of England, which never encourages cruelty or calumny. Let them seek for it amongst the members of the Church of Rome, and more especially amongst those who have renegade to it. There is nothing, however false and horrible, which a pervert to Rome will not say for his church, and which his priests will not encourage him in saying. And there is nothing, however horrible, the more horrible indeed and revolting to human nature. The more eager he would be to do it, which he will not do for it and which his priests will not encourage him in doing. Of the readiness which converts to popery exhibit to sacrifice all the ties of blood and affection on the shrine of their newly adopted religion. There is a curious illustration in the work of Luigi Pulci. This man, who was born in Florence in the year 1432, and who was deeply versed in the Bible, composed a poem, called the Morgante Maggiore, which he recited at the table of Lorenzo di Medici, the great patron of Italian genius. It is a mock-heroic and religious poem, in which the legends of knight-errantry, and of the Popish Church, are turned to unbounded ridicule. The pretended hero of it is a converted giant, called Morgante. Though his adventures do not occupy the 20th part of the poem, the principal personages being Charlemagne, Orlando, and his cousin Rinaldo of Montalban. Morgante has two brothers, both of them giants, and in the first canto of the poem, Morgante is represented with his brothers as carrying on a feud with the abbot and monks of a certain convent, built upon the confines of heathness. The giants being in the habit of flinging down stones, or rather huge rocks, on the convent. Orlando, however, who is banished from the court of Charlemagne, arriving at the convent, undertakes to destroy them, and, accordingly, kills Passamont and Alabastro, and converts Morgante, whose mind had been previously softened by a vision, in which the Blessed Virgin figures. No sooner is he converted than, as a sign of his penitence, what does he do, but hastens and cuts off the hands of his two brothers, saying, Io vio tagliare le mani a tutti quanti, e porterò a che manassi santi. 361. And he does cut off the hands of his brethren, and carries them to the abbot, who blesses him for so doing. Pulci here is holding up to ridicule and execration the horrid butchery or betrayal of friends by popish converts, and the encouragement they receive from the priest. No sooner is a person converted to popery, than his principal thought is how he can bring the hands and feet of his brethren, however harmless they may be, and different from the giants, to the holy priests, who, if he manages to do so, never fail to praise him, saying to the miserable wretch, as the abbot said to Morgante, Tu serai or perfetto e vito amico. A Cristo. Quaudo tu gli eri nemico. 362. Can the English public deny the justice of Pulci's illustration, after something which it has lately witnessed? Has it not seen equivalents for the hands and feet of brothers carried by popish perverts to the holy priests, and has it not seen the manner in which the offering has been received? Let those who are in quest of bigotry seek for it among the perverts to Rome, and not amongst those who, born in the pale of the Church of England, have always continued in it. Chapter 3. On Foreign Nonsense. With respect to the third point, various lessons which the book reads to the nation at large, and which it would be well for the nation to ponder and profit by. There are many species of nonsense to which the nation is much addicted, and of which the perusal of Lavengro ought to give them a wholesome shame. First of all, with respect to the foreign nonsense so prevalent now in England. The hero is a scholar. But, though possessed of a great many tongues, he affects to be neither Frenchman, nor German, nor this or that foreigner. He is one who loves his country, and the language and literature of his country, and speaks up for each and all when there is occasion to do so. Now what is the case with 9 out of 10 amongst those of the English who study foreign languages? No sooner have they picked up a smattering of this or that speech than they begin to abuse their own country, and everything connected with it, more especially its language. This is particularly the case with those who call themselves German students. It is said, and the writer believes with truth, that when a woman falls in love with a particularly ugly fellow, she squeezes him with 10 times more zest than she would a handsome one, if captivated by him. So it is with these German students. No sooner have they taken German in hand than there is nothing like German. Oh, the dear, delightful German! How proud I am that it is now my own, and that its divine literature is within my reach. And all this whilst mumbling the most uncouth speech, and crunching the most crabbed literature in Europe. The writer is not an exclusive admirer of everything English. He does not advise his country people never to go abroad, never to study foreign languages, and he does not wish to persuade them that there is nothing beautiful or valuable in foreign literature. He only wishes that they would not make themselves fools with respect to foreign people, foreign languages or reading. That if they chance to have been in Spain, and have picked up a little Spanish, they would not affect the airs of Spaniards. That if males they would not make tomfools of themselves by sticking cigars into their mouths, dressing themselves in zamarras, and saying, carajo. 363 And if females that they would not make zanies of themselves by sticking cigars into their mouths, flinging mantillas over their heads, and by saying caray, and perhaps carajo too. Or if they have been in France or Italy, and have picked up a little French or Italian, they would not affect to be French or Italians. And particularly, after having been a month or 2 in Germany, or picked up a little German in England, they would not make themselves foolish about everything German. As the Anglo-German in the book does, a real character, the founder of the Anglo-German school in England. And the cleverest Englishman who ever talked or wrote encomiastic nonsense about Germany and the Germans. Of all infatuations connected with what is foreign, the infatuation about everything that is German, to a certain extent prevalent in England, is assuredly the most ridiculous. One can find something like a palliation for people making themselves somewhat foolish about particular languages, literatures, and people. The Spanish certainly is a noble language, and there is something wild and captivating in the Spanish character, and its literature contains the grand book of the world. French is a manly language. The French are the great martial people in the world, and French literature is admirable in many respects. Italian is a sweet language, and of beautiful simplicity, its literature perhaps the first in the world. The Italians, wonderful men, have sprung up in Italy. Italy is not merely famous for painters, poets, musicians, singers, and linguists. The greatest linguist the world ever saw, the late Cardinal Mezzofanti, was an Italian. But it is celebrated for men emphatically speaking. Columbus was an Italian, Alexander Farnese was an Italian, so was the mightiest of the mighty, Napoleon Bonaparte. But the German language, German literature, and the Germans. The writer has already stated his opinion with respect to German. He does not speak from ignorance or prejudice. He has heard German spoken, and many other languages. German literature. He does not speak from ignorance, he has read that and many a literature, and he repeats, however, he acknowledges that there is one fine poem in the German language. That poem is the Oberon. 364 A poem, by the by, ignored by the Germans, a speaking fact, and of course, by the Anglo-Germanists. The Germans. He has been amongst them, and amongst many other nations, and confesses that his opinion of the Germans, as men, is a very low one. Germany, it is true, has produced one very great man, the monk who fought the Pope, and nearly knocked him down. But this man his countrymen, a telling fact, affect to despise, and, of course, the Anglo-Germanists, the father of Anglo-Germanism 365 was very fond of inveighing against Luther. The madness, or rather foolery, of the English for foreign customs, dresses, and languages, is not an affair of today, or yesterday, it is of very ancient date. And was very properly exposed nearly 3 centuries ago by one Andrew Board 366, who under the picture of a naked man, with a pair of shears in one hand, and a roll of cloth in the other, inserted the following lines along with others, 367. I am an Englishman, and naked I stand here, musing in my mind what garment I shall wear. For now I will wear this, and now I will wear that. Now I will wear, I cannot tell what. All new fashions be pleasant to me. I will have them, whether I thrive or thee. What do I care if all the world me fail? I will have a garment, shall reach to my tail. Then am I a minion, for I wear the new guise. The next year after I hope to be wise, not only in wearing my gorgeous array, for I will go to learning a whole summer's day. I will learn Latine, Hebrew, Greek, and French. And I will learn Dutch, sitting on my bench. I had no peer if to myself I were true. Because I am not so, diverse times do I rue. Yet I lack a nothing, I have all things at will. If I were wise and would hold myself still, and meddle with no matters but to me pertaining, but ever to be true to God and my King. But I have such matters rolling in my pate, that I will and do, I cannot tell what, etc. Chapter 4. On Gentility Nonsense. What is gentility? People in different stations in England entertain different ideas of what is genteel. 368, but it must be something gorgeous, glittering or tawdry, to be considered genteel by any of them. The beau ideal of the English aristocracy, of course with some exceptions, is some young fellow with an imperial title, a military personage of course. For what is military is so particularly genteel, with flaming epaulets, a cocked hat and plume, a prancing charger, and a band of fellows called generals and colonels, with flaming epaulets, cocked hats and plumes, and prancing chargers vaporing behind him. It was but lately that the daughter of an English marquis was heard to say, that the sole remaining wish of her heart, she had known misfortunes, and was not far from 50, was to be introduced to, whom? The Emperor of Austria. The sole remaining wish of the heart of one who ought to have been thinking of the grave and judgment, was to be introduced to the miscreant who had caused the blood of noble Hungarian females to be whipped out of their shoulders, for no other crime than devotion to their country and its tall and heroic sons. The middle classes, of course there are some exceptions, admire the aristocracy, and consider them pinks, the aristocracy who admire the Emperor of Austria, and adored the Emperor of Russia, till he became old, ugly and unfortunate, when their adoration instantly terminated. For what is more ungenteel than age, ugliness and misfortune? The beau ideal with those of the lower classes, with peasants and mechanics, is some flourishing railroad contractor. Look, for example, how they worship Mr. Flamson. 369 This person makes his grand debut in the year 39, at a public meeting in the principal room of a country inn. He has come into the neighborhood with the character of a man worth £1,000,000, who is to make everybody's fortune. At this time, however, he is not worth a shilling of his own, though he flashes about dexterously £3,000 or £4,000, part of which sum he has obtained by specious pretenses, and part from certain individuals who are his confederates. But in the year 49, he is really in possession of the fortune which he and his agents pretended he was worth 10 years before. He is worth £1,000,000. By what means has he come by them? By railroad contracts, for which he takes care to be paid in hard cash before he attempts to perform them, and to carry out which he makes use of the sweat and blood of wretches who, since their organization, have introduced crimes and language into England to which it was previously almost a stranger, by purchasing, with paper, shares by hundreds in the schemes to execute which he contracts, and which are of his own devising. Which shares he sells as soon as they are at a high premium, to which they are speedily forced by means of paragraphs, inserted by himself and agents, in newspapers devoted to his interest. utterly reckless of the terrible depreciation to which they are almost instantly subjected. But he is worth £1,000,000, there can be no doubt of the fact. He has not made people's fortunes, at least those whose fortunes it was said he would make, he has made them away. But his own he has made, emphatically made it, he is worth £1,000,000. Hurrah for the millionaire! The clown who views the pandemonium of red brick which he has built on the estate which he has purchased in the neighborhood of the place of his grand debut in which every species of architecture, Greek, Indian and Chinese, is employed in caricature, who hears of the grand entertainment he gives at Christmas in the principal dining room, the 100 wax candles, the wagon-load of plate, and the oceans of wine which form parts of it, and above all the 2 ostrich poults, one at the head, and the other at the foot of the table, exclaims, well, if he ain't bang up, I don't know who be, why he beats my Lord hollow. The mechanic of the borough town, who sees him dashing through the streets in an open landau, drawn by 4 milk-white horses, amidst its attendant outriders. His wife, a monster of a woman, by his side, stout as the wife of Tamerlane, who weighed 20 stone, and bedizened out like her whose person shone with the jewels of plundered Persia, stares with silent wonder, and at last exclaims, "That's the man for my vote." You tell the clown that the man of the mansion has contributed enormously to corrupt the rural innocence of England. You point to an incipient branch railroad, from around which the accents of Gomorrah are sounding, and beg him to listen for a moment, and then close his ears. Hodge scratches his head and says, "Well, I have nothing to say to that, all I know is that he is bang up, and I wish I were he." Perhaps he will add, a Hodge has been known to add, "He has been kind enough to put my son on that very railroad." 'Tis true the company is somewhat queer, and the work rather killing, but he gets there £0.50 a day, whereas from the farmers he would only get 18 pence. You remind the mechanic that the man in the landau has been the ruin of thousands, and you mention people whom he himself knows, people in various grades of life, widows and orphans amongst them, whose little all he has dissipated, and whom he has reduced to beggary by inducing them to become sharers in his delusive schemes. But the mechanic says, well, the more fools they to let themselves be robbed. But I don't call that kind of thing robbery, I merely call it outwitting. And everybody in this free country has a right to outwit others if he can. What a turnout he has! One was once heard to add, "I never saw a more genteel-looking man in all my life except one, and that was a gentleman's Wally, who was much like him." It is true he is rather undersized, but then, madam, you know, makes up for all. Chapter 5. Subject of gentility continued. In the last chapter have been exhibited specimens of gentility, so considered by different classes. By one class, power, youth and epaulettes are considered the ne plus ultra of gentility, by another class, pride, stateliness and title, by another, wealth and flaming tawdriness. But what constitutes a gentleman? It is easy to say at once what constitutes a gentleman, and there are no distinctions in what is gentlemanly 370 as there are in what is genteel. The characteristics of a gentleman are high feeling, a determination never to take a cowardly advantage of another, a liberal education, absence of narrow views, generosity and courage, propriety of behavior. Now a person may be genteel according to one or another of the 3 standards described above, and not possess one of the characteristics of a gentleman. Is the emperor a gentleman, with spatters of blood on his clothes, scourged from the backs of noble Hungarian women? Are the aristocracy gentlefolks, who admire him? Is Mr. Flamson a gentleman, although he has £1,000,000? No. Cowardly miscreants, admirers of cowardly miscreants. And people who make £1,000,000 by means compared with which those employed to make fortunes by the getters up of the South Sea bubble might be called honest dealing, are decidedly not gentlefolks. Now as it is clearly demonstrable that a person may be perfectly genteel according to some standard or other, and yet be no gentleman, so is it demonstrable that a person may have no pretensions to gentility, and yet be a gentleman. For example, there is Lavengro. Would the admirers of the emperor, or the admirers of those who admire the emperor, or the admirers of Mr. Flamson, call him genteel? And gentility with them is everything. Assuredly they would not, and assuredly they would consider him respectively as a being to be shunned, despised, or hooted. Genteel. Why at one time he is a hack author, writes revuels for 18 pence a page, edits a Newgate Chronicle. At another he wanders the country with a face grimy from occasionally mending kettles. And there is no evidence that his clothes are not seed-eaten torn, and his shoes down at the heel, but by what process of reasoning will they prove that he is no gentleman? Is he not learned? Has he not generosity and courage? Whilst a hack author, does he pawn the books entrusted to him to review? Does he break his word to his publisher? Does he write begging letters? Does he get clothes or lodgings without paying for them? Again, whilst a wanderer, does he insult helpless women on the road with loose proposals or ribald discourse? Does he take what is not his own from the hedges? Does he play on the fiddle, or make faces in public houses, in order to obtain pence or beer? Or does he call for liquor, swallow it, and then say to a widowed landlady, "Mistress, I have no brass"? In a word, what vice and crime does he perpetrate, what low acts does he commit? Therefore, with his endowments, who will venture to say that he is no gentleman, unless it be an admirer of Mr. Flamson, a clown, who will, perhaps, shout, "I say he is no gentleman." For who can be a gentleman who keeps no gig? The indifference exhibited by Lavengro for what is merely genteel, compared with his solicitude never to infringe the strict laws of honor, should read a salutary lesson. The generality of his countrymen are far more careful not to transgress the customs of what they call gentility, than to violate the laws of honor or morality. They will shrink from carrying their own carpet-bag, and from speaking to a person in seedy raiment, whilst to matters of much higher importance they are shamelessly indifferent. Not so Lavengro. He will do anything that he deems convenient, or which strikes his fancy, provided it does not outrage decency, or is unallied to profligacy. Is not ashamed to speak to a beggar in rags, and will associate with anybody, provided he can gratify a laudable curiosity. He has no abstract love for what is low, or what the world calls low. He sees that many things which the world looks down upon are valuable, so he prizes much which the world contemns. He sees that many things which the world admires are contemptible, so he despises much which the world does not. But when the world prizes what is really excellent, he does not contemn it, because the world regards it. If he learns Irish, which all the world scoffs at, he likewise learns Italian, which all the world melts at. If he learns Gypsy, the language of the tattered tent, he likewise learns Greek, the language of the college hall. If he learns smithery, he also learns, What does he learn to set against smithery? The law. No, he does not learn the law, which, by the way, is not very genteel. Swimming? Yes, he learns to swim. Swimming, however, is not genteel. And the world, at least the genteel part of it, acts very wisely in setting its face against it, for to swim you must be naked, and how would many a genteel person look without his clothes? Come, he learns horsemanship, a very genteel accomplishment, which every genteel person would gladly possess, though not all genteel people do. Again, as to associates, if he holds communion when a boy with Murtagh, the scarecrow of an Irish academy, he associates in after life with Francis Ardrey, a rich and talented young Irish gentleman about town. If he accepts an invitation from Mr. Petulengro to his tent, he has no objection to go home with a rich genius to dinner. Who then will say that he prizes a thing or a person because they are ungenteel? That he is not ready to take up with everything that is ungenteel he gives a proof, when he refuses, though on the brink of starvation, to become bonnet to the thimble-man, an office, which, though profitable, is positively ungenteel. But some sticker-up for gentility will exclaim, the hero did not refuse this office from an insurmountable dislike to its ungentility, but merely from a feeling of principle. Well, the writer is not fond of argument, and he will admit that such was the case. He admits that it was a love of principle, rather than an over-regard for gentility, which prevented the hero from accepting, when on the brink of starvation, an ungenteel though lucrative office. An office which, the writer begs leave to observe, many a person with a great regard for gentility, and no particular regard for principle, would in a similar strait have accepted. For when did a mere love for gentility keep a person from being a dirty scoundrel, when the alternatives apparently were either be a dirty scoundrel or starve? One thing, however, is certain, which is, that Lavengro did not accept the office, which if a love for what is low had been his ruling passion he certainly would have done. Consequently, he refuses to do one thing which no genteel person would willingly do, even as he does many things which every genteel person would gladly do, for example, speaks Italian, rides on horseback, associates with a fashionable young man, dines with a rich genius, etc. Yet, and it cannot be minced, he and gentility with regard to many things are at strange divergency. He shrinks from many things at which gentility placidly hums a tune, or approvingly simpers, and does some things at which gentility positively shrinks. He will not run into debt for clothes or lodgings, which he might do without any scandal to gentility. He will not receive money from Francis Ardrey, and go to Brighton with the sister of Annette Lenoir, though there is nothing ungenteel in borrowing money from a friend, even when you never intend to repay him, and something poignantly genteel in going to a watering place with a gay young Frenchwoman. But he has no objection, after raising £20 by the sale of that extraordinary work Joseph Sell, to set off into the country, mend kettles under hedgerows, and make pony and donkey shoes in a dingle. Here, perhaps, some plain, well-meaning person will cry, and with much apparent justice, how can the writer justify him in this act? What motive, save a love for what is low, could induce him to do such things? Would the writer have everybody who is in need of recreation go into the country, mend kettles under hedges, and make pony shoes in dingles? To such an observation the writer would answer, that Lavengro had an excellent motive in doing what he did, but that the writer is not so unreasonable as to wish everybody to do the same. It is not everybody who can mend kettles. It is not everybody who is in similar circumstances to those in which Lavengro was. Lavengro flies from London in hack authorship, and takes to the roads from fear of consumption. It is expensive to put up at inns, and even at public houses, and Lavengro has not much money. So he buys a tinker's cart and apparatus, and sets up as tinker, and subsequently as blacksmith. A person living in a tent, or in anything else, must do something or go mad. Lavengro had a mind, as he himself well knew, with some slight tendency to madness, and had he not employed himself, he must have gone wild. So to employ himself he drew upon one of his resources, the only one available at the time. Authorship had nearly killed him, he was sick of reading, and had besides no books. But he possessed the rudiments of an art akin to tinkering. He knew something of smithery, having served a kind of apprenticeship in Ireland to a fairy smith. So he draws upon his smithery to enable him to acquire tinkering, and through the help which it affords him, owing to its connection with tinkering, he speedily acquires that craft. Even as he had speedily acquired Welsh, owing to its connection with Irish, which language he possessed. And with tinkering he amuses himself until he lays it aside to resume smithery. A man who has any innocent resource, has quite as much right to draw upon it in need, as he has upon a banker in whose hands he has placed a sum. Lavengro turns to advantage, under particular circumstances, a certain resource which he has, but people who are not so forlorn as Lavengro, and have not served the same apprenticeship which he had, are not advised to follow his example. Surely he was better employed in plying the trades of tinker and smith than in having recourse to vice, in running after milkmaids, for example. Running after milkmaids is by no means an ungenteel rural diversion. But let anyone ask some respectable casuist, the Bishop of London for example, whether Lavengro was not far better employed, when in the country, at tinkering and smithery than he would have been in running after all the milkmaids in Cheshire, though tinkering is in general considered a very ungenteel employment, and smithery little better. Notwithstanding that an Arcadian poet 371 who wrote in Norse about 800 years ago, reckons the latter among 9 noble arts which he possessed, naming it along with playing at chess, on the harp, and reveling runes, or as the original has it, treading runes, that is, compressing them into a small compass by mingling one letter with another. Even as the Turkish calligraphists revel the Arabic letters, more especially those who write talismans. 9 arts have I, all noble. I play at chess so free. At reveling runes I'm ready. At books and smithery. I'm skilled o'er ice at skimming. On skates, I shoot and row. And few at harping match me. Or minstrelsy, I trow. But though Lavengro takes up smithery, which, though the Arcadian ranks it with chess-playing and harping, is certainly somewhat of a grimy art, there can be no doubt that, had he been wealthy and not so forlorn as he was, he would have turned to many things, honorable, of course, in preference. He has no objection to ride a fine horse when he has the opportunity. He has his daydream of making a fortune of £200,000 by becoming a merchant and doing business after the Armenian fashion. And there can be no doubt that he would have been glad to wear fine clothes, provided he had had sufficient funds to authorize him in wearing them. For the sake of wandering the country and plying the hammer and tongs, he would not have refused a commission in the service of that illustrious monarch George IV. Provided he had thought that he could live on his pay, and not be forced to run in debt to tradesmen, without any hope of paying them, for clothes and luxuries. As many highly genteel officers in that honorable service were in the habit of doing. For the sake of tinkering, he would certainly not have refused a secretaryship of an embassy to Persia, in which he might have turned his acquaintance with Persian, Arabic, and the Lord only knows what other languages, to account. He took to tinkering in smithery, because no better employments were at his command. No war is waged in the book against rank, wealth, fine clothes or dignified employments. It is shown, however, that a person may be a gentleman and a scholar without them. Rank, wealth, fine clothes and dignified employments, are no doubt very fine things, but they are merely externals, they do not make a gentleman. They add external grace and dignity to the gentleman and scholar, but they make neither. And is it not better to be a gentleman without them than not a gentleman with them? Is not Lavengro, when he leaves London on foot with £20 in his pocket, entitled to more respect than Mr. Flamson flaming in his coach with £1 million? And is not even the honest jockey at Horncastle, who offers a fair price to Lavengro for his horse, entitled to more than the scoundrel lord, who attempts to cheat him of 1/4 of its value? Millions, however, seem to think otherwise, by their servile adoration of people whom without rank, wealth and fine clothes they would consider infamous, but whom possessed of rank, wealth and glittering habiliments they seem to admire all the more for their profligacy and crimes. Does not a blood spot, or a lust spot, on the clothes of a blooming emperor, give a kind of zest to the genteel young god? Do not the pride, superciliousness and selfishness of a certain aristocracy make it all the more regarded by its worshippers? And do not the clownish and gutter-blood admirers of Mr. Flamson like him all the more because they are conscious that he is a knave? If such is the case, and alas, is it not the case? They cannot be too frequently told that fine clothes, wealth and titles adorn a person in proportion as he adorns them. That if worn by the magnanimous and good they are ornaments indeed, but if by the vile and profligate they are merely sanbenitos, and only serve to make their infamy doubly apparent. And that a person in seedy raiment and tattered hat, possessed of courage, kindness and virtue, is entitled to more respect from those to whom his virtues are manifested than any cruel profligate emperor, selfish aristocrat, or knavish millionaire in the world. The writer has no intention of saying that all in England are affected with the absurd mania for gentility, nor is such a statement made in the book. It is shown therein that individuals of various classes can prize a gentleman, notwithstanding seedy raiment, dusty shoes or tattered hat, for example, the young Irishman, the rich genius, the postillion, and his employer. Again, when the life of the hero is given to the world, amidst the howl about its lowness and vulgarity, raised by the servile crew whom its independence of sentiment has stung. More than one powerful voice has been heard testifying approbation of its learning and the purity of its morality. That there is some salt in England, minds not swayed by mere externals, he is fully convinced. If he were not, he would spare himself the trouble of writing. But to the fact that the generality of his countrymen are basely grovelling before the shrine of what they are pleased to call gentility, he cannot shut his eyes. Oh! What a clever person that Cockney was, who, travelling in the Aberdeen railroad carriage, after edifying the company with his remarks on various subjects, gave it as his opinion that Lieutenant P. 372 would, in future, be shunned by all respectable society. And what a simple person that elderly gentleman was, who, abruptly starting, asked in rather an authoritative voice, and why should Lieutenant P. be shunned by respectable society? And who, after entering into what was said to be a masterly analysis of the entire evidence of the case, concluded by stating, that having been accustomed to all kinds of evidence all his life, he had never known a case in which the accused had obtained a more complete and triumphant justification than Lieutenant P. had done in the late trial. Now the Cockney, who is said to have been a very foppish Cockney, was perfectly right in what he said, and therein manifested a knowledge of the English mind and character, and likewise of the modern English language, to which his catechist, who, it seems, was a distinguished member of the Scottish bar, could lay no pretensions. The Cockney knew what the Lord of Session knew not, that the British public is gentility crazy, and he knew, moreover, that gentility and respectability are synonymous. No one in England is genteel or respectable that is looked at, who is the victim of oppression. He may be pitied for a time, but when did not pity terminate in contempt? A poor harmless young officer, but why enter into the details of the infamous case? They are but too well known, and if ever cruelty, pride and cowardice, and things much worse than even cruelty, cowardice and pride were brought to light, and, at the same time, countenanced, they were in that case. What availed the triumphant justification of the poor victim? There was at first a roar of indignation against his oppressors, but how long did it last? He had been turned out of the service, they remained in it with their red coats and epaulets. He was merely the son of a man who had rendered good service to his country. They were, for the most part, highly connected, they were in the extremest degree genteel, he quite the reverse. So the nation wavered, considered, thought the genteel side was the safest after all, and then with the cry of, "Oh! There is nothing like gentility," ratted bodily. Newspaper and public turned against the victim, scouted him, apologized for the, what should they be called? Who were not only admitted into the most respectable society, but courted to come, the spots not merely of wine on their military clothes, giving them a kind of poignancy. But there is a God in heaven, the British glories are tarnished, Providence has never smiled on British arms since that case, oh! Balaclava. 373 Thy name interpreted is net of fishes, and well dost thou deserve that name. How many a scarlet golden fish has of late perished in the mud amidst thee, cursing the genteel service, and the genteel leader which brought him to such a doom. Whether the rage for gentility is most prevalent amongst the upper, middle or lower classes it is difficult to say. The priest in the text seems to think that it is exhibited in the most decided manner in the middle class. It is the writer's opinion, however, that in no class is it more strongly developed than in the lower. What they call being well-born goes a great way amongst them. But the possession of money much farther, whence Mr. Flamson's influence over them. Their rage against, and scorn for, any person who by his courage and talents has advanced himself in life, and still remains poor, are indescribable. He is no better than ourselves, they say, why should he be above us? For they have no conception that anybody has a right to ascendancy over themselves except by birth or money. This feeling amongst the vulgar has been, to a certain extent, the bane of the two services, naval and military. The writer does not make this assertion rashly. He observed this feeling at work in the army when a child, and he has good reason for believing that it was as strongly at work in the Navy at the same time, and is still as prevalent in both. Why are not brave men raised from the ranks? Is frequently the cry, why are not brave sailors promoted? The Lord help brave soldiers and sailors who are promoted. They have less to undergo from the high airs of their brother officers, and those are hard enough to endure, than from the insolence of the men. Soldiers and sailors promoted to command are said to be in general tyrants. In 9 cases out of 10, when they are tyrants, they have been obliged to have recourse to extreme severity in order to protect themselves from the insolence and mutinous spirit of the men. He is no better than ourselves, shoot him, bayonet him, or fling him overboard, they say of some obnoxious individual raised above them by his merit. Soldiers and sailors in general will bear any amount of tyranny from a lordly sot, or the son of a man who has plenty of brass, their own term, but will mutiny against the just orders of a skillful and brave officer who is no better than themselves. There was the affair of the Bounty, for example. Bligh was one of the best seamen that ever trod deck, and one of the bravest of men. Proofs of his seamanship he gave by steering, amidst dreadful weather, a deeply laden boat for nearly 4,000 miles over an almost unknown ocean, of his bravery, at the fight of Copenhagen. One of the most desperate ever fought, of which after Nelson he was the hero. He was, moreover, not an unkind man. But the crew of the Bounty mutinied against him, and set him half naked in an open boat, with certain of his men who remained faithful to him, and ran away with the ship. Their principal motive for doing so was an idea, whether true or groundless the writer cannot say, that Bligh was no better than themselves. He was certainly neither a lord's illegitimate, nor possessed of £20,000. The writer knows what he is writing about, having been acquainted in his early years with an individual who was turned adrift with Bligh, and who died about the year 22, a lieutenant in the Navy, in a provincial town in which the writer was brought up. 374 The ringleaders in the mutiny were 2 scoundrels, Christian and Young, who had great influence with the crew, because they were genteelly connected. Bligh, after leaving the Bounty, had considerable difficulty in managing the men who had shared his fate, because they considered themselves as good men as he, notwithstanding that to his conduct and seamanship they had alone to look, under heaven, for salvation from the ghastly perils that surrounded them. Bligh himself, in his journal, alludes to this feeling. Once 375 when he and his companions landed on a desert island, one of them said, with a mutinous look, that he considered himself as good a man as he. Bligh, seizing a cutlass, called upon him to take another and defend himself, whereupon the man said that Bligh was going to kill him, and made all manner of concessions. Now why did this fellow consider himself as good a man as Bligh? Was he as good a seaman? No, nor a 10th part as good. As brave a man? No, nor a 10th part as brave. And of these facts he was perfectly well aware, but bravery and seamanship stood for nothing with him, as they still stand with thousands of his class. Bligh was not genteel by birth or money, therefore Bligh was no better than himself. Had Bligh, before he sailed, got a £20,000 prize in the lottery, he would have experienced no insolence from this fellow, for there would have been no mutiny in the Bounty. He is our betters, the crew would have said, and it is our duty to obey him. The wonderful power of gentility in England is exemplified in nothing more than in what it is producing amongst Jews, Gypsies and Quakers. It is breaking up their venerable communities. All the better, someone will say. Alas! Alas! It is making the wealthy Jews forsake the synagogue for the opera house, or the gentility chapel, in which a disciple of Mr. Platitude, in a white surplice, preaches a sermon at noonday from a desk, on each side of which is a flaming taper. It is making them abandon their ancient literature, their Mishnah, their Gemara, their Zohar, for gentility novels, the Young Duke, the most unexceptionably genteel book ever written, being the principal favorite. It makes the young Jew ashamed of the young Jewess, it makes her ashamed of the young Jew. The young Jew marries an opera dancer, or if the dancer will not have him, as is frequently the case, the cast-off miss of the Honorable Spencer so-and-so. It makes the young Jewess accept the honorable offer of a cashiered lieutenant of the Bengal native infantry. Or, if such a person does not come forward, the dishonorable offer of a cornet of a regiment of crack hussars. It makes poor Jews, male and female, forsake the synagogue for the sixpenny theatre or penny hop. The Jew to take up with an Irish female of loose character, and the Jewess with a musician of the Guards, or the Tipperary servant of Captain Mulligan. With respect to the gypsies, it is making the women what they never were before, harlots, and the men what they never were before, careless fathers and husbands. It has made the daughter of Ursula, the chaste, take up with the bass drummer of a wild beast show. It makes Gorgico Brown, the gypsy man, leave his tent and his old wife, of an evening, and thrust himself into society which could well dispense with him. "Brother," said Mr. Lavengro the other day to the Romany Rye, after telling him many things connected with the decadence of gypsyism, "there is one Gorgico Brown, who, with a face as black as a tea-kettle, wishes to be mistaken for a Christian tradesman. He goes into the parlor of a third-rate inn of an evening, calls for rum and water, and attempts to enter into conversation with the company about politics and business. The company flout him or give him the cold shoulder, or perhaps complain to the landlord, who comes and asks him what business he has in the parlor, telling him if he wants to drink to go into the tap-room, and perhaps collars him and kicks him out, provided he refuses to move. With respect to the Quakers, it makes the young people like the young Jews, crazy after gentility diversions, worship, marriages or connections, and makes old Peas do what it makes Gorgico Brown do. Thrust himself into society which could well dispense with him, and out of which he is not kicked, because unlike the gypsy he is not poor." The writer would say much more on these points, but want of room prevents him. He must therefore request the reader to have patience until he can lay before the world a pamphlet, which he has been long meditating. To be entitled Remarks on the strikingly similar effects which a love for gentility has produced, and is producing, amongst Jews, gypsies and Quakers. The priest in the book has much to say on the subject of this gentility nonsense. No person can possibly despise it more thoroughly than that very remarkable individual seems to do, yet he hails its prevalence with pleasure, knowing the benefits which will result from it to the church of which he is the sneering slave. "The English are mad after gentility," says he. "Well, all the better for us. Their religion for a long time past has been a plain and simple one, and consequently by no means genteel. They'll quit it for ours, which is the perfection of what they admire. With which Templars, Hospitallers, mitred abbots, Gothic abbeys, long-drawn aisles, golden censers, incense, etc., are connected. Nothing, or next to nothing, of Christ, it is true, but weighed in the balance against gentility, where will Christianity be? Why, kicking against the beam, ho! Ho!" And in connection with the gentility nonsense, he expatiates largely, and with much contempt, on a species of literature by which the interests of his church in England have been very much advanced. All genuine priests have a thorough contempt for everything which tends to advance the interests of their church. This literature is made up of pseudo-Jacobitism, Charlie O'er the Waterism, or nonsense about Charlie O'er the Water. And the writer will now take the liberty of saying a few words about it on his own account. Chapter 6. On Scotch Gentility Nonsense. Of the literature just alluded to, Scott was the inventor. It is founded on the fortunes and misfortunes of the Stuart family, of which Scott was the zealous defender and apologist, doing all that in his power lay to represent the members of it as noble, chivalrous, high-minded, unfortunate princes. Though, perhaps, of all the royal families that ever existed upon earth, this family was the worst. It was unfortunate enough, it is true. But it owed its misfortunes entirely to its crimes, viciousness, bad faith, and cowardice. Nothing will be said of it here until it made its appearance in England to occupy the English throne. The first of the family which we have to do with, James, was a dirty, cowardly miscreant, of whom the less said the better. His son, Charles I, was a tyrant, exceedingly cruel and revengeful, but weak and dastardly. He caused a poor fellow to be hanged in London, who was not his subject, because he had heard that the unfortunate creature had once bit his own glove at Cadiz, in Spain, at the mention of his name. And he permitted his own bulldog, Strafford, to be executed by his own enemies, though the only crime of Strafford was, that he had barked furiously at those enemies, and had worried 2 or 3 of them, when Charles shouted, "Fetch 'em." He was a bitter, but yet a despicable enemy, and the coldest and most worthless of friends. For though he always hoped to be able, some time or other, to hang his enemies, he was always ready to curry favor with them, more especially if he could do so at the expense of his friends. He was the haughtiest, yet meanest of mankind. He once caned a young nobleman for appearing before him in the drawing-room not dressed exactly according to the court etiquette. Yet he condescended to flatter and compliment him who, from principle, was his bitterest enemy, namely Harrison, when the Republican colonel was conducting him as a prisoner to London. His bad faith was notorious. It was from abhorrence of the first public instance which he gave of his bad faith, his breaking his word to the Infanta of Spain, that the poor Hiberno Spaniard bit his glove at Cadiz. And it was his notorious bad faith which eventually cost him his head. For the Republicans would gladly have spared him, provided they could put the slightest confidence in any promise, however solemn, which he might have made to them. Of them, it would be difficult to say whether they most hated or despised him. Religion he had none. One day he favored popery. The next, on hearing certain clamors of the people, he sent his wife's domestics back packing to France, because they were papists. Papists, however, should make him a saint, for he was certainly the cause of the taking of Rochelle. His son, Charles II, though he passed his youth in the school of adversity, learned no other lesson from it than the following one: take care of yourself, and never do an action, either good or bad, which is likely to bring you into any great difficulty. And this maxim he acted up to as soon as he came to the throne. He was a papist, but took especial care not to acknowledge his religion, at which he frequently scoffed, till just before his last gasp, when he knew that he could lose nothing, and hoped to gain everything by it. He was always in want of money, but took care not to tax the country beyond all endurable bounds, preferring to such a bold and dangerous course, to become the secret pensioner of Louis, to whom, in return for his gold, he sacrificed the honor and interests of Britain. He was too lazy and sensual to delight in playing the part of a tyrant himself, but he never checked tyranny in others save in one instance. He permitted beastly butchers to commit unmentionable horrors on the feeble, unarmed and disunited Covenanters of Scotland, but checked them when they would fain have endeavoured to play the same game on the numerous united, dogged and warlike independents of England. To show his filial piety, he bade the hangman dishonour the corpses of some of his father's judges, before whom, when alive, he ran like a screaming hare, but permitted those who had lost their all in supporting his father's cause, to pine in misery and want. He would give to a painted harlot £1,000 for a loathsome embrace, and to a player or buffoon 100 for a trumpery pun, but would refuse a penny to the widow or orphan of an old royalist soldier. He was the personification of selfishness, and as he loved and cared for no one, so did no one love or care for him. So little had he gained the respect or affection of those who surrounded him, that after his body had undergone an after-death examination, parts of it were thrown down the sinks of the palace, to become eventually the prey of the swine and ducks of Westminster. His brother, who succeeded him, James II, was a papist, but sufficiently honest to acknowledge his popery, but upon the whole, he was a poor creature. Though a tyrant, he was cowardly. Had he not been a coward he would never have lost his throne. There were plenty of lovers of tyranny in England who would have stood by him, provided he would have stood by them, and would, though not papists, have encouraged him in his attempt to bring back England beneath the sway of Rome, and perhaps would eventually have become papists themselves. But the nation raising a cry against him, and his son-in-law, the Prince of Orange, invading the country, he forsook his friends, of whom he had a host, but for whom he cared little, left his throne, for which he cared a great deal, and Popery in England, for which he cared yet more, to their fate, and escaped to France, from whence, after taking a little heart, he repaired to Ireland, where he was speedily joined by a gallant army of Papists whom he basely abandoned at the Boyne, running away in a most lamentable condition, at the time when by showing a little courage he might have enabled them to conquer. This worthy, in his last will, bequeathed his heart to England, his right arm to Scotland, and his bowels to Ireland. What the English and Scotch said to their respective bequests is not known, but it is certain that an old Irish priest, supposed to have been a great-granduncle of the present Reverend Father Murtagh, on hearing of the bequest to Ireland, fell into a great passion, and having been brought up at Paris and Salamanca, expressed his indignation in the following strain: Malditas son tus tripas. Teniamos bastante del olor de tus tripas al tiempo de tu huida de la batalla del Boyne. 376. His son, generally called the Old Pretender, though born in England, was carried in his infancy to France, where he was brought up in the strictest principles of Popery, which principles, however, did not prevent him becoming, when did they ever prevent anyone? A worthless and profligate scoundrel. There are some doubts as to the reality of his being a son of James, which doubts are probably unfounded, the grand proof of his legitimacy being the thorough baseness of his character. It was said of his father that he could speak well, and it may be said of him that he could write well, the only thing he could do which was worth doing. Always supposing that there is any merit in being able to write. He was of a mean appearance, and, like his father, pusillanimous to a degree. The meanness of his appearance disgusted, and his pusillanimity discouraged, the Scotch when he made his appearance amongst them in the year 1715. Some time after the standard of rebellion had been hoisted by March. He only stayed a short time in Scotland, and then, seized with panic, retreated to France, leaving his friends to shift for themselves as they best could. He died a pensioner of the Pope. The son of this man, Charles Edward, of whom so much in latter years has been said and written, was a worthless, ignorant youth, and a profligate and illiterate old man. When young, the best that can be said of him is, that he had occasionally springs of courage, invariably at the wrong time and place, which merely served to lead his friends into inextricable difficulties. When old, he was loathsome and contemptible to both friend and foe. His wife loathed him, and for the most terrible of reasons. She did not pollute his couch, for to do that was impossible, he had made it so vile, but she betrayed it, inviting to it not only Alfieri the filthy, but the coarsest grooms. Dr. King, the warmest and almost last adherent of his family, said that there was not a vice or crime of which he was not guilty. As for his foes, they scorned to harm him even when in their power. In the year 1745 he came down from the Highlands of Scotland, which had long been a focus of rebellion. He was attended by certain clans of the Highlands, desperadoes used to freebootery from their infancy, and, consequently, to the use of arms, and possessed of a certain species of discipline. With these he defeated at Prestonpans a body of men called soldiers, but who were in reality peasants and artisans, levied about a month before, without discipline or confidence in each other, and who were miserably massacred by the Highland army. He subsequently invaded England, nearly destitute of regular soldiers, and penetrated as far as Derby, from which place he retreated on learning that regular forces which had been hastily recalled from Flanders were coming against him, with the Duke of Cumberland at their head. He was pursued, and his rear guard overtaken and defeated by the dragoons of the Duke at Clifton, from which place the rebels retreated in great confusion across the Eden into Scotland, where they commenced dancing Highland reels and strathspeys on the bank of the river, for joy at their escape, whilst a number of wretched girls, paramours of some of them, were perishing in the waters of the swollen river in an attempt to follow them. They themselves passed over by 80s and by hundreds, arm in arm, for mutual safety, without the loss of a man, but they left the poor paramours to shift for themselves. Nor did any of these canny people after passing the stream dash back to rescue a single female life, no. They were too well employed upon the bank in dancing strathspeys to the tune of Charlie O'er the Water. It was, indeed, Charlie O'er the Water, and canny Highlanders o'er the water, but where were the poor prostitutes meantime? In the water. The Jacobite farce, or tragedy, was speedily brought to a close by the Battle of Culloden. There did Charlie wish himself back again o'er the water, exhibiting the most unmistakable signs of pusillanimity. There were the clans cut to pieces, at least those who could be brought to the charge, and there fell Giles Macbean, or as he was called in Gaelic, Giliosa Macbeathan, a kind of giant. 6 feet 4 inches and a quarter high, than whom, as his wife said in a Coronach 377 she made upon him. No man who stood at Quilloiter was taller. Giles Mac being the major of the clan Cattan, a great drinker, a great fisher, a great shooter, and the champion of the Highland host. The last of the Stuarts was a cardinal. Such were the Stuarts, such their miserable history. They were dead and buried in every sense of the word until Scott resuscitated them. How? By the power of fine writing, and by calling to his aid that strange divinity, gentility. He wrote splendid novels about the Stuarts, in which he represents them as unlike what they really were, as the graceful and beautiful Papillon is unlike the hideous and filthy worm. In a word, he made them genteel, and that was enough to give them paramount sway over the minds of the British people. The public became Stuart mad, and everybody, especially the women, said, what a pity it was that we hadn't a Stuart to govern. All parties, Whig, Tory or Radical, became Jacobite at heart, and admirers of absolute power. The Whigs talked about the liberty of the subject, and the Radicals about the rights of man still, but neither party cared a straw for what it talked about, and mentally swore that, as soon as by means of such stuff they could get places, and fill their pockets, they would be as Jacobite as the Jacobs themselves. As for the Tories, no great change in them was necessary, everything favoring absolutism and slavery being congenial to them. So the whole nation, that is, the reading part of the nation, with some exceptions, for thank God there has always been some salt in England, went over the water to Charlie. But going over to Charlie was not enough, they must, or at least a considerable part of them, go over to Rome too, or have a hankering to do so. As the priest sarcastically observes in the text, as all the Jacobs were papists, so the good folks who through Scott's novels admire the Jacobs must be papists too. An idea got about that the religion of such genteel people as the Stuarts must be the climax of gentility, and that idea was quite sufficient. Only let a thing, whether temporal or spiritual, be considered genteel in England, and if it be not followed it is strange indeed. So Scott's writings not only made the greater part of the nation Jacobite, but popish. Here some people will exclaim, whose opinions remain sound and uncontaminated, what you say is perhaps true with respect to the Jacobite nonsense at present so prevalent being derived from Scott's novels. But the popish nonsense, which people of the genteeler classes are so fond of, is derived from Oxford. We sent our sons to Oxford, nice honest lads, educated in the principles of the Church of England, and at the end of the first term they came home puppies, talking popish nonsense, which they had learned from the pedants to whose care we had entrusted them. Aye, not only popery but Jacobitism, which they hardly carried with them from home, for we never heard them talking Jacobitism before they had been at Oxford. But now their conversation is a farrago of popish and Jacobite stuff, complans and clavers. Now, what these honest folks say is, to a certain extent, founded on fact. The popery which has overflowed the land during the last 14 or 15 years, has come immediately from Oxford, and likewise some of the Jacobitism, popish and Jacobite nonsense. And little or nothing else, having been taught at Oxford for about that number of years. But whence did the pedants get the popish nonsense with which they have corrupted youth? Why, from the same quarter from which they got the Jacobite nonsense with which they have inoculated those lads who were not inoculated with it before, Scott's novels. Jacobitism and Laudiism, a kind of half-popery, had at one time been very prevalent at Oxford, but both had been long consigned to oblivion there. And people at Oxford cared as little about Laud as they did about the Pretender. Both were dead and buried there, as everywhere else, till Scott called them out of their graves when the pedants of Oxford hailed both, I, and the Pope, too. As soon as Scott had made the old fellow fascinating, through particular novels, more especially The Monastery and Abbot, then the quiet, respectable, honourable Church of England would no longer do for the pedants of Oxford. They must belong to a more genteel church. They were ashamed at first to be downright Romans, so they would be Lauds. The pale-looking, but exceedingly genteel nonjuring clergyman in Waverley was a Laud. But they soon became tired of being Lauds, for Laud's church, gewgawish and idolatrous as it was not sufficiently tinselly and idolatrous for them, so they must be popes, but in a sneaking way. Still calling themselves Church of England men, in order to batten on the bounty of the church which they were betraying. And likewise have opportunities of corrupting such lads as might still resort to Oxford with principles uncontaminated. So the respectable people, whose opinions are still sound, are, to a certain extent, right when they say that the tide of popery, which has flowed over the land, has come from Oxford. It did come immediately from Oxford, but how did it get to Oxford? Why, from Scott's novels. Oh! That sermon which was the first manifestation of Oxford feeling, preached at Oxford sometime in the year 38 by a divine of a weak and confused intellect, in which popery was mixed up with Jacobitism. The present writer remembers perfectly well, on reading some extracts from it at the time in a newspaper, on the top of a coach, exclaiming, "Why! The simpleton has been pilfering from Walter Scott's novels. Oh, Oxford pedants! Oxford pedants! Ye whose politics and religion are both derived from Scott's novels. What a pity it is that some lad of honest parents, whose mind ye are endeavouring to stultify with your nonsense about Complans and Clavers, has not the spirit to start up and cry, 'Confound your gibberish! I'll have none of it. Hurrah for the Church, and the principles of my father.'" Chapter 7. Same subject continued. Now what could have induced Scott to write novels tending to make people Papists and Jacobites, and in love with arbitrary power? Did he think that Christianity was a gaudy mummery? He did not, he could not, for he had read the Bible, yet was he fond of gaudy mummeries, fond of talking about them. Did he believe that the Stuarts were a good family, and fit to govern a country like Britain? He knew that they were a vicious, worthless crew, and that Britain was a degraded country as long as they swayed the sceptre. But for those facts he cared nothing. They governed in a way which he liked, for he had an abstract love of despotism, and an abhorrence of everything savouring of freedom and the rights of man in general. His favourite political picture was a joking, profligate, careless king, nominally absolute, the heads of great houses paying court to, but in reality governing, that king, whilst revelling with him on the plunder of a nation, and a set of crouching, grovelling vassals. The literal meaning of vassal is a wretch, who, after allowing themselves to be horsewhipped, would take a bone if flung to them, and be grateful. So that in love with mummery, though he knew what Christianity was, no wonder he admired such a church as that of Rome, and that which Laud set up, and by nature formed to be the holder of the candle to ancient worm-eaten and profligate families. No wonder that all his sympathies were with the Stuarts and their dissipated insolent party, and all his hatred directed against those who endeavoured to check them in their proceedings, and to raise the generality of mankind something above a state of vassalage, that is, wretchedness. Those who were born great, were, if he could have had his will, always to remain great, however worthless their characters. Those who were born low, were always to remain so, however great their talents, though, if that rule were carried out, where would he have been himself? In the book which he called The History of Napoleon Bonaparte, in which he plays the sycophant to all the legitimate crowned heads in Europe, whatever their crimes, vices or miserable imbecilities, he, in his abhorrence of everything low which by its own vigour makes itself illustrious, calls Murat of the Sabre the son of a pastry cook, of a Marseillais pastry cook. It is a pity that people who give themselves hoity-toity airs, and the Scotch in general are wonderfully addicted to giving themselves hoity-toity airs. And checking people better than themselves with their birth 378 and their country, it is a great pity that such people do not look at home, son of a pastry cook, of a Marseillais pastry cook. Well, and what was Scott himself? Why, son of a pettifogger, of an Edinburgh pettifogger. Oh, but Scott was descended from the old cow-stealers of Buccleuch, and therefore, descended from old cow-stealers, was he? Well, had he had nothing to boast of beyond such a pedigree, he would have lived and died the son of a pettifogger, and been forgotten, and deservedly so. But he possessed talents, and by his talents rose like Marat, and like him will be remembered for his talents alone, and deservedly so. Yes, but Marat was still the son of a pastry cook, and though he was certainly good at the sabre, and cut his way to a throne, still, Lord, what fools there are in the world! But as no one can be thought anything of in this world without a pedigree, the writer will now give a pedigree for Marat, of a very different character from the cow-stealing one of Scott. But such a one as the proudest he might not disdain to claim. Scott was descended from the old cow-stealers of Buccleuch, was he? Good. And Marat was descended from the old Moors of Spain, from the Abencerrages 379, sons of the saddle, of Granada. The name Marat is Arabic, and is the same as Murad, le desire, or the wished-for one. Scott in his genteel life of Bonaparte, says that, when Marat was in Egypt, the similarity between the name of the celebrated Mameluke Murad and that of Bonaparte's Milor Sabreur was remarked, and became the subject of jest amongst the comrades of the gallant Frenchman. But the writer of the novel of Bonaparte did not know that the names were one and the same. Now which was the best pedigree, that of the son of the pastry cook, or that of the son of the pettifogger? Which was the best blood? Let us observe the workings of the two bloods. He who had the blood of the sons of the saddle in him, became the wonderful cavalier of the most wonderful host that ever went forth to conquest. Won for himself a crown and died the death of a soldier, leaving behind him a son, only inferior to himself in strength, in prowess, and in horsemanship. The descendant of the cow-stealer became a poet, a novel writer, the panegyrist of great folk and genteel people. Became insolvent because, though an author, he deemed it ungenteel to be mixed up with the business part of authorship. Died paralytic and broken-hearted because he could no longer give entertainments to great folks. Leaving behind him, amongst other children, who were never heard of, a son, who, through his father's interest, had become lieutenant colonel in a genteel cavalry regiment. A son who was ashamed of his father because his father was an author, a son who, why ask which was the best blood? So, owing to his rage for gentility, Scott must needs become the apologist of the Stuarts and their party, but God made this man pay dearly for taking the part of the wicked against the good. For lauding up to the skies the miscreants and robbers, and calumniating the noble spirits of Britain, the salt of England, and his own country. As God had driven the Stuarts from their throne, and their followers from their estates, making them vagabonds and beggars on the face of the earth, taking from them all they cared for. So did that same God, who knows perfectly well how and where to strike, deprive the apologist of that wretched crew of all that rendered life pleasant in his eyes. The lack of which paralyzed him in body and mind, rendered him pitiable to others, loathsome to himself, so much so, that he once said, "Where is the beggar who would change places with me? Notwithstanding all my fame?" Ah! God knows perfectly well how to strike. He permitted him to retain all his literary fame to the very last, his literary fame for which he cared nothing. But what became of the sweetness of life, his fine house, his grand company, and his entertainments? The grand house ceased to be his. He was only permitted to live in it on sufferance, and whatever grandeur it might still retain. It soon became as desolate a looking house as any misanthrope could wish to see. Where were the grand entertainments and the grand company? There are no grand entertainments where there is no money. No lords and ladies where there are no entertainments, and there lay the poor lodger in the desolate house, groaning on a bed no longer his. Smitten by the hand of God in the part where he was most vulnerable. Of what use telling such a man to take comfort, for he had written the Minstrel and Rob Roy, telling him to think of his literary fame? Literary fame, indeed. He wanted back his lost gentility. Retain my altar. I care nothing for it, but, oh! Touch not my beard. Parney's War of the Gods. He dies, his children die too, and then comes the crowning judgment of God on what remains of his race and the house which he had built. He was not a papist himself, nor did he wish anyone belonging to him to be popish, for he had read enough of the Bible to know that no one can be saved through popery. Yet had he a sneaking affection for it, and would at times in an underhand manner, give it a good word both in writing and discourse, because it was a gaudy kind of worship. And ignorance and vassalage prevailed so long as it flourished, but he certainly did not wish any of his people to become papists, nor the house which he had built to become a popish house. Though the very name he gave it savoured of popery. But popery becomes fashionable through his novels and poems. The only one that remains of his race, a female grandchild, marries a person who, following the fashion, becomes a papist. And makes her a papist too. Money abounds with the husband, who buys the house, and then the house becomes the rankest popish house in Britain. A superstitious person might almost imagine that one of the old Scottish Covenanters. Whilst the grand house was being built from the profits resulting from the sale of writings favouring popery and persecution, and calumniatory of Scotland's saints and martyrs, had risen from the grave, and banned Scott, his race, and his house, by reading a certain psalm. In saying what he has said about Scott, the author has not been influenced by any feeling of malice or ill will, but simply by a regard for truth, and a desire to point out to his countrymen the harm which has resulted from the perusal of his works. He is not one of those who would depreciate the talents of Scott. He admires his talents, both as a prose writer and a poet. As a poet especially he admires him, and believes him to have been by far the greatest, with perhaps the exception of Mickiewicz, who only wrote for unfortunate Poland, that Europe has given birth to during the last 100 years. As a prose writer he admires him less, it is true, but his admiration for him in that capacity is very high. And he only laments that he prostituted his talents to the cause of the Stuarts and gentility. What book of fiction of the present century can you read twice, with the exception of Waverley and Rob Roy? There is Pelham, it is true, which the writer of these lines has seen a Jewess reading in the steppe of Debrecen, and which a young Prussian baron, a great traveller, whom he met at Constantinople in '44, told him he always carried in his valise. And, in conclusion, he will say, in order to show the opinion which he entertains of the power of Scott as a writer, that he did for the spectre of the wretched pretender what all the kings of Europe could not do for his body, placed it on the throne of these realms. And for popery, what popes and cardinals strove in vain to do for 3 centuries, brought back its mummeries and nonsense into the temples of the British Isles. Scott during his lifetime had a crowd of imitators, who, whether they wrote history so-called, poetry so-called, or novels, nobody would call a book a novel if he could call it anything else, wrote Charlie o'er the water nonsense. And now that he has been dead nearly a quarter of a century, there are others daily springing up who are striving to imitate Scott in his Charlie o'er the water nonsense, for nonsense it is, even when flowing from his pen. They, too, must write Jacobite histories, Jacobite songs, and Jacobite novels, and much the same figure as the scoundrel menials in the comedy cut when personating their masters, and retailing their master's conversation, do they cut as Walter Scott's. In their histories, they too talk about the Prince and Glenfinnan, and the Pibroch, and in their songs about Claverse and Bonnie Dundee. But though they may be Scots, they are not Walter Scott's. But it is perhaps chiefly in the novel that you see the veritable hog in armor. The time of the novel is of course the 15 or 45. The hero a Jacobite, and connected with one or other of the enterprises of those periods. And the author, to show how unprejudiced he is, and what original views he takes of subjects, must needs speak up for popery, whenever he has occasion to mention it. Though with all his originality, when he brings his hero and the vagabonds with which he is concerned before a barricaded house, belonging to the Whigs, He can make them get into it by no other method than that which Scott makes his rioters employ to get into the toll-booth, burning down the door. To express the more than utter foolishness of this latter Charlie o'er the water nonsense, whether in rhyme or prose, there is but one word, and that word a Scotch word. Scotch, the sorriest of jargons, compared with which even Rothwelsh is dignified and expressive, has yet one word to express what would be inexpressible by any word or combination of words in any language, or in any other jargon in the world. And very properly, for as the nonsense is properly Scotch, so should the word be Scotch which expresses it. That word is fushionless, pronounced fushionless. And when the writer has called the nonsense fushionless, and he does call it fushionless, he has nothing more to say, but leaves the nonsense to its fate. Chapter 8. On Canting Nonsense. The writer now wishes to say something on the subject of canting nonsense, of which there is a great deal in England. There are various cants in England, amongst which is the religious cant. He is not going to discuss the subject of religious cant, lest, however, he should be misunderstood. He begs leave to repeat that he is a sincere member of the old-fashioned Church of England, in which he believes there is more religion, and consequently less cant, than in any other church in the world. Nor is he going to discuss many other cants. He shall content himself with saying something about two, the temperance cant and the unmanly cant. Temperance canters say that it is unlawful to drink a glass of ale. Unmanly canters say that it is unlawful to use one's fists. The writer begs leave to tell both these species of canters that they do not speak the words of truth. It is very lawful to take a cup of ale, or wine, for the purpose of cheering or invigorating yourself when you are faint and downhearted. And likewise to give a cup of ale or wine to others when they are in a similar condition. The Holy Scripture saith nothing to the contrary, but rather encourageth people in so doing by the text, wine maketh glad the heart of man. But it is not lawful to intoxicate yourself with frequent cups of ale or wine, nor to make others intoxicated, nor does the Holy Scripture say that it is. The Holy Scripture no more says that it is lawful to intoxicate yourself or others, than it says that it is unlawful to take a cup of ale or wine yourself, or to give one to others. Noah is not commended in the Scripture for making himself drunken on the wine he brewed. Nor is it said that the Saviour, when he supplied the guests with first-rate wine at the marriage feast, told them to make themselves drunk upon it. He is said to have supplied them with first-rate wine, but he doubtless left the quantity which each should drink to each party's reason and discretion. When you set a good dinner before your guests, you do not expect that they should gorge themselves with the victuals you set before them. Wine may be abused, and so may a leg of mutton. Second, it is lawful for anyone to use his fists in his own defense, or in the defense of others, provided they can't help themselves, but it is not lawful to use them for purposes of tyranny or brutality. If you are attacked by a ruffian, as the elderly individual in Lavengro is in the inn-yard, it is quite lawful, if you can, to give him as good a thrashing as the elderly individual gave the brutal coachman. And if you see a helpless woman, perhaps your own sister, set upon by a drunken lord, a drunken coachman, or a drunken coalheaver, or a brute of any description, either drunk or sober, it is not only lawful, but laudable to give them, if you can, a good drubbing. But it is not lawful because you have a strong pair of fists, and know how to use them, to go swaggering through a fair, jostling against unoffending individuals. Should you do so, you would be served quite right if you were to get a drubbing, more particularly if you were served out by someone less strong, but more skillful than yourself, even as the coachman was served out by a pupil of the immortal Broughton, 60 years old, it is true, but possessed of Broughton's guard and chop. Moses is not blamed in the Scripture for taking part with the oppressed, and killing an Egyptian persecutor. We are not told how Moses killed the Egyptian. But it is quite as creditable to Moses to suppose that he killed the Egyptian by giving him a buffet under the left ear, as by stabbing him with a knife. It is true that the Saviour in the New Testament tells his disciples to turn the left cheek to be smitten, after they had received a blow on the right. But he was speaking to people divinely inspired, or whom he intended divinely to inspire, people selected by God for a particular purpose. He likewise tells these people to part with various articles of raiment when asked for them, and to go a-travelling without money, and take no thought of the morrow. Are those exhortations carried out by very good people in the present day? Do Quakers, when smitten on the right cheek, turn the left to the smiter? When asked for their coat, do they say, "Friend, take my shirt also"? Has the Dean of Salisbury no purse? Does the Archbishop of Canterbury go to an inn, run up a reckoning, and then say to his landlord, "Mistress, I have no coin"? Assuredly the Dean has a purse, and a tolerably well-filled one. And, assuredly, the Archbishop, on departing from an inn, not only settles his reckoning, but leaves something handsome for the servants. And does not say that he is forbidden by the gospel to pay for what he has eaten, or the trouble he has given, as a certain Spanish cavalier said he was forbidden by the statutes of chivalry. Now, to take the part of yourself, or the part of the oppressed, with your fists, is quite as lawful in the present day as it is to refuse your coat and your shirt also to any vagabond who may ask for them, and not to refuse to pay for supper, bed and breakfast, at the Feathers, or any other inn, after you have had the benefit of all three. The conduct of Lavengro with respect to drink may, upon the whole, serve as a model. He is no drunkard, nor is he fond of intoxicating other people. Yet when the horrors are upon him he has no objection to go to a public-house and call for a pint of ale, nor does he shrink from recommending ale to others when they are faint and downcast. In one instance, it is true, he does what cannot be exactly justified. He encourages the priest in the dingle, in more instances than one, in drinking more Hollands and water than is consistent with decorum. He has a motive indeed in doing so. A desire to learn from the knave in his cups the plans and hopes of the propaganda of Rome. Such conduct, however, was inconsistent with strict fair dealing and openness. And the author advises all those whose consciences never reproach them for a single unfair or covert act committed by them, to abuse him heartily for administering Hollands and water to the priest of Rome. In that instance the hero is certainly wrong, yet in all other cases with regard to drink, he is manifestly right. To tell people that they are never to drink a glass of ale or wine themselves, or to give one to others, is cant, and the writer has no toleration for cant of any description. Some cants are not dangerous, but the writer believes that a more dangerous cant than the temperance cant, or as it is generally called, teetotalism, is scarcely to be found. The writer is willing to believe that it originated with well-meaning, though weak people. But there can be no doubt that it was quickly turned to account by people who were neither well-meaning nor weak. Let the reader note particularly the purpose to which this cry has been turned in America, the land, indeed, par excellence, of humbug and humbug cries. It is there continually in the mouth of the most violent political party, and is made an instrument of almost unexampled persecution. The writer would say more on the temperance cant, both in England and America, but want of space prevents him. There is one point on which he cannot avoid making a few brief remarks, that is, the inconsistent conduct of its apostles in general. The teetotal apostle says, "It is a dreadful thing to be drunk." So it is, teetotaler, but if so, why do you get drunk? I get drunk? Yes, unhappy man, why do you get drunk on smoke and passion? Why are your garments impregnated with the odor of the Indian weed? Why is there a pipe or a cigar always in your mouth? Why is your language more dreadful than that of a poissard? Tobacco smoke is more deleterious than ale, teetotaler. Bile more potent than brandy. You are fond of telling your hearers what an awful thing it is to die drunken. So it is, teetotaler. Then take good care that you do not die with smoke and passion, drunken, and with temperance language on your lips, that is, abuse and calumny against all those who differ from you. One word of sense you have been heard to say, which is, that spirits may be taken as a medicine. Now you are in a fever of passion, teetotaler, so, pray take this tumbler of brandy. Take it on the homeopathic principle, that heat is to be expelled by heat. You are in a temperance fury, so swallow the contents of this tumbler, and it will, perhaps, cure you. You look at the glass wistfully, you say you occasionally take a glass medicinally, and it is probable you do. Take one now. Consider what a dreadful thing it would be to die passion drunk. To appear before your Maker with intemperate language on your lips. That's right. You don't seem to wince at the brandy. That's right, well done. All down in 2 pulls. Now you look like a reasonable being. If the conduct of Lavengro with regard to drink is open to little censure, assuredly the use which he makes of his fists is entitled to none at all. Because he has a pair of tolerably strong fists, and knows to a certain extent how to use them, is he a swaggerer or oppressor? To what ill account does he turn them? Who more quiet, gentle and inoffensive than he? He beats off a ruffian who attacks him in a dingle, has a kind of friendly tussle with Mr. Petulengro, and behold the extent of his fistic exploits. Aye, but he associates with prize-fighters, and that very fellow, Petulengro, is a prize-fighter, and has fought for a stake in a ring. Well, and if he had not associated with prize-fighters, how could he have used his fists? Oh, anybody can use his fists in his own defense, without being taught by prize-fighters. Can they? Then why does not the Italian, or Spaniard, or Afghan use his fists when insulted or outraged, instead of having recourse to the weapons which he has recourse to? Nobody can use his fists without being taught the use of them by those who have themselves been taught, no more than anyone can whiffle without being taught by a master of the art. Now let any man of the present day try to whiffle. Would not anyone who wished to whiffle have to go to a master of the art? Assuredly. But where would he find one at the present day? The last of the whifflers 380 hanged himself about a fortnight ago on a bell rope in a church steeple of the Old Town, from pure grief that there was no further demand for the exhibition of his art. There being no demand for whiffling since the discontinuation of Guildhall banquets. Whiffling is lost. The old chap left his sword behind him, let anyone take up the old chap's sword and try to whiffle. Now much the same hand as he would make who should take up the whiffler's sword and try to whiffle, would he who should try to use his fists who had never had the advantage of a master. Let no one think that men use their fists naturally in their own disputes. Men have naturally recourse to any other thing to defend themselves or to offend others. They fly to the stick, to the stone, to the murderous and cowardly knife, or to abuse as cowardly as the knife, and occasionally more murderous. Now which is best when you hate a person, or have a pique against a person, to clench your fist and say, "Come on," or to have recourse to the stone, the knife, or murderous calumny? The use of the fist is almost lost in England. Yet are the people better than they were when they knew how to use their fists? The writer believes not. A fisty combat is at present a great rarity, but the use of the knife, the noose, and of poison, to say nothing of calumny, are of more frequent occurrence in England than perhaps in any country in Europe. Is polite taste better than when it could bear the details of a fight? The writer believes not. 2 men cannot meet in a ring to settle a dispute in a manly manner without some trumpery local newspaper letting loose a volley of abuse against the disgraceful exhibition. In which abuse it is sure to be sanctioned by its dainty readers. Whereas some murderous horror, the discovery for example of the mangled remains of a woman in some obscure den, is greedily seized hold on by the moral journal, and dressed up for its readers, who luxuriate and gloat upon the ghastly dish. Now, the writer of Lavengro has no sympathy with those who would shrink from striking a blow, but would not shrink from the use of poison or calumny. And his taste has little in common with that which cannot tolerate the hardy details of a prize fight, but which luxuriates on descriptions of the murder dens of modern England. But prize fighters and pugilists are blackguards, a reviewer has said, and blackguards they would be provided they employed their skill and their prowess for purposes of brutality and oppression. But prize fighters and pugilists are seldom friends to brutality and oppression. And which is the blackguard, the writer would ask, he who uses his fists to take his own part, or instructs others to use theirs for the same purpose, or the being who from envy and malice, or at the bidding of a malicious scoundrel, endeavors by calumny, falsehood, and misrepresentation to impede the efforts of lonely and unprotected genius? One word more about the race, all but extinct, of the people opprobriously called prize-fighters. Some of them have been as noble, kindly men as the world ever produced. Can the rolls of the English aristocracy exhibit names belonging to more noble, more heroic men than those who were called respectively Pierce, Cribb and Spring? Did ever one of the English aristocracy contract the seeds of fatal consumption by rushing up the stairs of a burning edifice, even to the topmost garret, and rescuing a woman from seemingly inevitable destruction? The writer says no. A woman was rescued from the top of a burning house, but the man who rescued her was no aristocrat. It was Pierce, not Percy, who ran up the burning stairs. Did ever one of those glittering ones save a fainting female from the libidinous rage of 6 ruffians? The writer believes not. A woman was rescued from the libidinous fury of 6 monsters on, down, but the man who rescued her was no aristocrat. It was Pierce, not Powlett, who rescued the woman, and thrashed my lord's 6 gamekeepers, Pierce, whose equal never was, and probably never will be, found in sturdy combat. Are there any of the aristocracy of whom it can be said that they never did a cowardly, cruel or mean action, and that they invariably took the part of the unfortunate and weak against cruelty and oppression? As much can be said of Cribb, of Spring, and the other, but where is the aristocrat of whom as much can be said? Wellington? Wellington indeed. A skillful general, and a good man of valor, it is true, but with that cant word of duty continually on his lips. Did he rescue Ney from his butchers? Did he lend a helping hand to Warner? In conclusion, the writer would advise those of his countryfolks who read his book to have nothing to do with the 2 kinds of canting nonsense described above, but in their progress through life to enjoy as well as they can, but always with moderation, the good things of this world, to put confidence in God, to be as independent as possible, and to take their own parts. If they are low-spirited, let them not make themselves foolish by putting on sackcloth, drinking water, or chewing ashes, but let them take wholesome exercise, and eat the most generous food they can get, taking up and reading occasionally, not the lives of Ignatius Loyola and Francis Spira 381 but something more agreeable. For example, the life and adventures of Mr. Duncan Campbell 382 The Deaf and Dumb Gentleman. The Travels of Captain Falconer in America 383 and the Journal of John Randall 384 who went to Virginia and married an Indian wife. Not forgetting, amidst their eating and drinking, their walks over heaths, and by the seaside, and their agreeable literature, to be charitable to the poor, to read the Psalms and to go to church twice on a Sunday. In their dealings with people, to be courteous to everybody, as Lavengro was, but always independent like him. And if people meddle with them, to give them as good as they bring, even as he and Isabel Berners were in the habit of doing. And it will be as well for him to observe that he by no means advises women to be too womanly, but bearing the conduct of Isabel Berners in mind, to take their own parts, and if anybody strikes them, to strike again. Beating of women by the lords of the creation has become very prevalent in England since pugilism has been discountenanced. Now the writer strongly advises any woman who is struck by a ruffian to strike him again. Or if she cannot clench her fists, and he advises all women in these singular times to learn to clench their fists, to go at him with tooth and nail, and not to be afraid of the result. For any fellow who is dastard enough to strike a woman, would allow himself to be beaten by a woman, were she to make at him in self-defense, even if, instead of possessing the stately height and athletic proportions of the aforesaid Isabel, she were as diminutive in stature, and had a hand as delicate, and foot as small, as a certain royal lady, who was some time ago assaulted by a fellow upwards of 6 feet high, whom the writer has no doubt she could have beaten had she thought proper to go at him. Such is the deliberate advice of the author to his countrymen and women, advice in which he believes there is nothing unscriptural or repugnant to common sense. The writer is perfectly well aware that, by the plain language which he has used in speaking of the various kinds of nonsense prevalent in England, he shall make himself a multitude of enemies. But he is not going to conceal the truth or to tamper with nonsense, from the fear of provoking hostility. He has a duty to perform and he will perform it resolutely. He is the person who carried the Bible to Spain, and as resolutely as he spoke in Spain against the superstitions of Spain, will he speak in England against the nonsense of his own native land. He is not one of those who, before they sit down to write a book, say to themselves, "What cry shall we take up? What principles shall we advocate? What principles shall we abuse?" Before we put pen to paper we must find out what cry is the loudest, what principle has the most advocates, otherwise, after having written our book, we may find ourselves on the weaker side. A sailor of the Bounty waked from his sleep by the noise of the mutiny, lay still in his hammock for some time, quite undecided whether to take part with the captain or to join the mutineers. "I must mind what I do," said he to himself, "lest, in the end, I find myself on the weaker side." Finally, on hearing that the mutineers were successful, he went on deck, and seeing Bligh pinioned to the mast, he put his fist to his nose, and otherwise insulted him. Now, there are many writers of the present day whose conduct is very similar to that of the sailor. They lie listening in their corners till they have ascertained which principle has most advocates. Then, presently, they make their appearance on the deck of the world with their book. If truth has been victorious, then has truth their hurrah. But if truth is pinioned against the mast, then is their fist thrust against the nose of truth, and their jibe and their insult spurted in their face. The strongest party had the sailor, and the strongest party has almost invariably the writer of the present day. Chapter 9. Pseudo-Critics. A certain set of individuals calling themselves critics have attacked Lavengro with much virulence and malice. If what they call criticism had been founded on truth, the author would have had nothing to say. The book contains plenty of blemishes, some of them, by the by, willful ones, as the writer will presently show. Not one of these, however, has been detected and pointed out. But the best passages in the book, indeed whatever was calculated to make the book valuable, have been assailed with abuse and misrepresentation. The duty of the true critic is to play the part of a leech, and not of a viper. Upon true and upon malignant criticism there is an excellent fable by the Spaniard Iriarte. 385 The viper says to the leech, "Why do people invite your bite, and flee from mine?" "Because," says the leech, "people receive health from my bite, and poison from yours." There is as much difference, says the clever Spaniard, between true and malignant criticism, as between poison and medicine. Certainly a great many meritorious writers have allowed themselves to be poisoned by malignant criticism. The writer, however, is not one of those who allow themselves to be poisoned by pseudo-critics. No. No. He will rather hold them up by their tails, and show the creatures wriggling, blood and foam streaming from their broken jaws. First of all, however, he will notice one of their objections. "The book isn't true," say they. Now one of the principal reasons with those who have attacked Lavengro for their abuse of it is, that it is particularly true in one instance, namely, that it exposes their own nonsense. Their love of humbug, their slavishness, their dressings, their goings out, their scraping and bowing to great people. It is the showing up of gentility nonsense in Lavengro that has been one principal reason for the raising the above cry. For in Lavengro is denounced the besetting folly of the English people, a folly which those who call themselves guardians of the public taste are far from being above. "We can't abide anything that isn't true," they exclaim. Can't they? Then why are they so enraptured with any fiction that is adapted to purposes of humbug, which tends to make them satisfied with their own proceedings, with their own nonsense? Which does not tell them to reform, to become more alive to their own failings, and less sensitive about the tyrannical goings-on of the masters, and the degraded condition, the sufferings, and the trials of the serfs in the star Jupiter? Had Lavengro, instead of being the work of an independent mind, been written in order to further any of the 1001 cants and species of nonsense prevalent in England, the author would have heard much less about its not being true, both from public detractors and private censurers. But Lavengro pretends to be an autobiography, say the critics. And here the writer begs leave to observe, that it would be well for people who profess to have a regard for truth not to exhibit in every assertion which they make a most profligate disregard of it. This assertion of theirs is a falsehood, and they know it to be a falsehood. 386 in the preface. Lavengro is stated to be a dream. And the writer takes this opportunity of stating that he never said it was an autobiography, never authorized any person to say that it was one. And that he has in innumerable instances declared in public and private, both before and after the work was published, that it was not what is generally termed an autobiography, but a set of people who pretend to write criticisms on books, hating the author for various reasons, amongst others, because, having the proper pride of a gentleman and a scholar, he did not, in the year 43, choose to permit himself to be exhibited and made a zany of in London. And especially because he will neither associate with, nor curry favor with, them who are neither gentlemen nor scholars, attack his book with abuse and calumny. He is, perhaps, condescending too much when he takes any notice of such people. As, however, the English public is wonderfully led by cries and shouts, and generally ready to take part against any person who is either unwilling or unable to defend himself, he deems it advisable not to be altogether quiet with those who assail him. The best way to deal with vipers is to tear out their teeth, and the best way to deal with pseudo-critics is to deprive them of their poison bag, which is easily done by exposing their ignorance. The writer knew perfectly well the description of people with whom he would have to do, he therefore very quietly prepared a stratagem, by means of which he could at any time exhibit them, powerless and helpless, in his hand. Critics, when they review books, ought to have a competent knowledge of the subjects which those books discuss. Lavengro is a philological book, a poem if you choose to call it so. Now what a fine triumph it would have been for those who wished to vilify the book and its author. Provided they could have detected the latter tripping in his philology, they might have instantly said that he was an ignorant pretender to philology. They laughed at the idea of his taking up a viper by its tail, a trick which hundreds of country urchins do every September, but they were silent about the really wonderful part of the book, the philological matter. They thought philology was his stronghold, and that it would be useless to attack him there. They of course would give him no credit as a philologist, for anything like fair treatment towards him was not to be expected at their hands. But they were afraid to attack his philology, yet that was the point, and the only point in which they might have attacked him successfully. He was vulnerable there. How was this? Why, in order to have an opportunity of holding up pseudo-critics by the tails, he willfully spelt various foreign words wrong, Welsh words, and even Italian words. Did they detect these misspellings? Not one of them, even as he knew they would not, and he now taunts them with ignorance. And the power of taunting them with ignorance is the punishment which he designed for them, a power which they might but for their ignorance have used against him. The writer, besides knowing something of Italian and Welsh, knows a little of Armenian language and literature. But who, knowing anything of the Armenian language, unless he had an end in view, would say that the word for sea in Armenian is anything like the word tide in English? The word for sea in Armenian is zao, a word connected with the Tibetan word for water, and the Chinese shui, and the Turkish su, signifying the same thing. But where is the resemblance between zao and tide? Again, the word for bread in ancient Armenian is hats. Yet the Armenian on London Bridge is made to say zats, which is not the nominative of the Armenian noun for bread, but the accusative. Now, critics, ravening against a man because he is a gentleman and a scholar, and has not only the power but also the courage to write original works, why did not you discover that weak point? Why, because you were ignorant, so here ye are held up. Moreover, who with a name commencing with Z, ever wrote fables in Armenian? There are two writers of fables in Armenian, Varthan and Kasht, and illustrious writers they are, one in the simple, and the other in the ornate style of Armenian composition. But neither of their names begins with AZ. Oh, what a precious opportunity ye lost, ye ravening crew, of convicting the poor, half-starved, friendless boy of the book, of ignorance or misrepresentation, by asking who with a name beginning with Z ever wrote fables in Armenian. But ye couldn't help yourselves, ye are dunce. We dunce. I, dunce. So here ye are held up by the tails, blood and foam streaming from your jaws. The writer wishes to ask here, what do you think of all this, Messrs. Les Critiques? Were ye ever served so before? But don't you richly deserve it? Haven't you been for years past bullying and insulting everybody whom you deemed weak, and currying favor with everybody whom you thought strong? We approve of this. We disapprove of that. Oh, this will never do. These are fine lines. The lines perhaps some horrid sycophantic rubbish addressed to Wellington, or Lord So-and-so. To have your ignorance thus exposed, to be shown up in this manner, and by whom? A gypsy. Aye, a gypsy was the very right person to do it. But is it not galling, after all? Ah, but we don't understand Armenian, it cannot be expected that we should understand Armenian, or Welsh, or... Hey, what's this? The mighty we not understand Armenian or Welsh, or... Then why does the mighty we pretend to review a book like Lavengro? From the arrogance with which it continually delivers itself, one would think that the mighty we is omniscient. That it understands every language, is versed in every literature, yet the mighty we does not even know the word for bread in Armenian. It knows bread well enough by name in English, and frequently bread in England only by its name, but the truth is, that the mighty we, with all its pretension, is in general a very sorry creature. Who, instead of saying nous dicens, should rather say nous dis, Parney in his guerre de deux, very profanely makes the three in one say, je faisans. Now, Lavengro, who is anything but profane, would suggest that critics, especially magazine and Sunday newspaper critics, should commence with nous dis. As the first word would be significant of the conceit and assumption of the critic, and the second of the extent of the critic's information. The we says it say, but when fawning sycophancy or vulgar abuse are taken from that say, what remains? Why a blank, a void, like Janungagap. 387. As the writer, of his own accord, has exposed some of the blemishes of his book, a task, which a competent critic ought to have done, he will now point out 2 or 3 of its merits. Which any critic, not altogether blinded with ignorance, might have done, or not replete with gall and envy would have been glad to do. The book has the merit of communicating a fact connected with physiology, which in all the pages of the multitude of books was never previously mentioned, the mysterious practice of touching objects to baffle the evil chance. The miserable detractor will, of course, instantly begin to rave about such a habit being common, well and good, but was it ever before described in print, or all connected with it dissected? He may then vociferate something about Johnson having touched, the writer cares not whether Johnson, who, by the by, during the last 20 or 30 years, owing to people having become ultra-Tory mad from reading Scott's novels and the Quarterly Review, has been a mighty favorite. Especially with some who were in the habit of calling him a half-crazy old fool, touched, or whether he did or not. But he asks where did Johnson ever describe the feelings which induced him to perform the magic touch, even supposing that he did perform it? Again, the history gives an account of a certain book called The Sleeping Bard, the most remarkable prose work of the most difficult language but one, of modern Europe, a book, for a notice of which, he believes, one might turn over in vain the pages of any review printed in England, or, indeed, elsewhere. So here are 2 facts, one literary and the other physiological, for which any candid critic was bound to thank the author, even as in the Romany rye there is a fact connected with Iro-Norman myth, for the disclosing of which any person who pretends to have a regard for literature is bound to thank him, namely, that the mysterious Finn or Fingal of Ossian's poems is one and the same person as the Sigurd Fafnisbane of the Edda and the Wilkina, and the Siegfried Horn of the Lay of the Nibelungs. The writer might here conclude, and, he believes, most triumphantly. As, however, he is in the queue for writing, which he seldom is, he will for his own gratification, and for the sake of others, dropping metaphors about vipers and serpents, show up in particular 2 or 3 sets or cliques of people, who, he is happy to say, have been particularly virulent against him and his work. For nothing indeed could have given him greater mortification than their praise. In the first place, he wishes to dispose of certain individuals who call themselves men of wit and fashion, about town, who he is told have abused his book vastly, their own word. These people paint their cheeks, wear white kid gloves, and dabble in literature, or what they conceive to be literature. For abuse from such people, the writer was prepared. Does anyone imagine that the writer was not well aware, before he published his book, that, whenever he gave it to the world, he should be attacked by every literary coxcomb in England who had influence enough to procure the insertion of a scurrilous article in a magazine or newspaper? He has been in Spain, and has seen how invariably the mule attacks the horse. Now why does the mule attack the horse? Why, because the latter carries about with him that which the envious hermaphrodite does not possess. They consider, forsooth, that his book is low, but he is not going to waste words about them, one or two of whom, he is told, have written very duncy books about Spain, and are highly enraged with him, because certain books which he wrote about Spain were not considered duncy. No, he is not going to waste words upon them, for verily he dislikes their company, and so he'll pass them by, and proceed to others. The Scotch Charlie o'er the water people have been very loud in the abuse of Lavengro. This again might be expected. The sarcasms of the priest about the Charlie o'er the water nonsense of course stung them. Oh! It is one of the claims which Lavengro has to respect, that it is the first, if not the only work, in which that nonsense is, to a certain extent, exposed. 2 or 3 of their remarks on passages of Lavengro, he will reproduce and laugh at. Of course your Charlie o'er the water people are genteel exceedingly, and cannot abide anything low. Gypsyism they think is particularly low, and the use of gypsy words in literature beneath its gentility. So they object to gypsy words being used in Lavengro where gypsies are introduced speaking. What is Romany forsooth, say they. Very good. And what is Scotch? Has not the public been nauseated with Scotch for the last 30 years? Ah, but Scotch is not. The writer believes he knows much better than the Scotch what Scotch is and what it is not. He has told them before what it is, a very sorry jargon. He will now tell them what it is not, a sister or an immediate daughter of the Sanskrit, which Romany is. Aye, but the Scotch are foxes, nothing else than foxes, even like the gypsies, the difference between the gypsy and Scotch fox being that the first is wild, with a mighty brush. The other a sneak with a gilt collar and without a tail. A Charlie o'er the water person attempts to be witty, because the writer has said that perhaps a certain old Edinburgh high school porter, of the name of Bowie, was perhaps of the same blood as a certain Bowie, a northern Kemp who distinguished himself at the Battle of Horringer Bay. 388 A pretty matter, forsooth, to excite the ridicule of a Scotchman. Why, is there a beggar or trumpery fellow in Scotland, who does not pretend to be somebody, or related to somebody? Is not every Scotchman descended from some king, Kemp or cow-stealer of old, by his own account at least? Why, the writer would even go so far as to bet a trifle that the poor creature, who ridicules Bowie's supposed ancestry, has one of his own, at least as grand and as apocryphal as old Bowie's of the high school. The same Charlie o'er the water person is mightily indignant that Lavengro should have spoken disrespectfully of William Wallace. Lavengro, when he speaks of that personage, being a child of about 10 years old, and repeating merely what he had heard. All the Scotch, by the by, for a great many years past, have been great admirers of William Wallace, particularly the Charlie o'er the water people, who in their nonsense verses about Charlie generally contrive to bring in the name of William, Willie, or Wooly, Wallace. The writer begs leave to say that he by no means wishes to bear hard against William Wallace, but he cannot help asking why, if William, Willie, or Wooly Wallace was such a particularly nice person, did his brother Scots betray him to a certain renowned southern warrior, called Edward Longshanks, who caused him to be hanged and cut into 4 in London, and his quarters to be placed over the gates of certain towns. They got gold, it is true, and titles, very nice things, no doubt. But, surely, the life of a patriot is better than all the gold and titles in the world, at least Lavengro thinks so, but Lavengro has lived more with gypsies than Scotch men. And gypsies do not betray their brothers. It would be some time before a gypsy would hand over his brother to the harembeck 389, even supposing you would not only make him a king, but a justice of the peace, and not only give him the world, but the best farm on the Holcombe estate. 390. But gypsies are wild foxes, and there is certainly a wonderful difference between the way of thinking of the wild fox who retains his brush, and that of the scurvy kennel creature who has lost his tail. Ah! But thousands of Scotch, and particularly the Charlie o'er the water people, will say, we didn't sell Willie Wallace. It was our forebears who sold Willie Wallace. If Edward Longshanks had asked us to sell Willie Wallace, we would soon have shown him that, Lord better ye poor trumpery set of creatures. Ye would not have acted a bit better than your forefathers. Remember how ye have ever treated the few amongst ye who, though born in the kennel, have shown something of the spirit of the wood. Many of ye are still alive who delivered over men, quite as honest and patriotic as William Wallace, into the hands of an English minister, to be chained and transported for merely venturing to speak and write in the cause of humanity, at the time when Europe was beginning to fling off the chains imposed by kings and priests. And it is not so very long since Burns, to whom ye are now building up obelisks rather higher than he deserves, was permitted by his countrymen to die in poverty and misery, because he would not join with them in songs of adulation to kings and the trumpery great. So say not that ye would have acted with respect to William Wallace one whit better than your fathers, and you in particular, ye children of Charlie, whom do ye write nonsense verses about? A family of dastard despots, who did their best, during a century and more, to tread out the few sparks of independent feeling still glowing in Scotland, but enough has been said about ye. Amongst those who have been prodigal in abuse and defamation of Lavengro, have been your modern radicals, and particularly a set of people who filled the country with noise against the King and Queen, Wellington, and the Tories, in 32. About these people the writer will presently have occasion to say a good deal, and also of real radicals. As, however, it may be supposed that he is one of those who delight to play the sycophant to kings and queens, to curry favour with Tories, and to bepraise Wellington, he begs leave to state that such is not the case. About kings and queens he has nothing to say, about Tories, simply that he believes them to be a bad set. About Wellington, however, it will be necessary for him to say a good deal, of mixed import, as he will subsequently frequently have occasion to mention him in connection with what he has to say about pseudo-radicals. Chapter 10. Pseudo-Radicals. About Wellington, then, he says, that he believes him at the present day to be infinitely overrated. But there certainly was a time when he was shamefully underrated. Now what time was that? Why, the time of pseudo-radicalism, par excellence, from 20 to 32. Oh, the abuse that was heaped on Wellington by those who traded in radical cant, your newspaper editors and review writers. And how he was sneered at then by your Whigs, and how faintly supported he was by your Tories, who were half ashamed of him. For your Tories, though capital fellows as followers, when you want nobody to back you, are the faintest creatures in the world when you cry in your agony, come and help me. Oh, assuredly Wellington was infamously used at that time, especially by your traders in radicalism, who howled at and hooted him, said he had every vice, was no general, was beaten at Waterloo, was a poltroon, moreover a poor illiterate creature, who could scarcely read or write. Nay, a principal radical paper said boldly he could not read, and devised an ingenious plan for teaching Wellington how to read. Now this was too bad. And the writer, being a lover of justice, frequently spoke up for Wellington, saying, that as for vice, he was not worse than his neighbors, that he was brave. That he won the fight at Waterloo, from a half-dead man, it is true, but that he did win it. Also, that he believed he had read rules for the manual and platoon exercises to some purpose. Moreover, that he was sure he could write, for that he the writer had once written to Wellington, and had received an answer from him. Nay, the writer once went so far as to strike a blow for Wellington. For the last time he used his fists was upon a radical sub-editor, who was mobbing Wellington in the street, from behind a rank of grimy fellows. But though the writer spoke up for Wellington to a certain extent when he was shamefully underrated, and once struck a blow for him when he was about being hustled, he is not going to join in the loathsome sycophantic nonsense which it has been the fashion to use with respect to Wellington these last 20 years. Now what have those years been to England? Why, the years of ultra-gentility, everybody in England having gone gentility mad during the last 20 years, and no people more so than your pseudo-radicals. Wellington was turned out, and your Whigs and Radicals got in, and then commenced the period of ultra-gentility in England. The Whigs and Radicals only hated Wellington as long as the patronage of the country was in his hands, none of which they were tolerably sure he would bestow on them. But no sooner did they get it into their own, than they forthwith became admirers of Wellington. And why? Because he was a duke, petted at Windsor and by foreign princes, and a very genteel personage. Formerly many of your Whigs and Radicals had scarcely a decent coat on their backs. But now the plunder of the country was at their disposal, and they had as good a chance of being genteel as any people. So they were willing to worship Wellington because he was very genteel, and could not keep the plunder of the country out of their hands. And Wellington has been worshipped, and prettily so, during the last 15 or 20 years. He is now a noble fine-hearted creature, the greatest general the world ever produced. The bravest of men, and, mercy upon us, the greatest of military writers. Now the present writer will not join in such sycophancy. As he was not afraid to take the part of Wellington when he was scurvily used by all parties, and when it was dangerous to take his part, so he is not afraid to speak the naked truth about Wellington in these days, when it is dangerous to say anything about him but what is sycophantically laudatory. He said in 32-391 that as to vice, Wellington was not worse than his neighbors, but he is not going to say in 54 that Wellington was a noble-hearted fellow. For he believes that a more cold-hearted individual never existed. His conduct to Warner, the poor Vaudois, and Marshal Ney, showed that. He said in 32 that he was a good general and a brave man. But he is not going, in 54, to say that he was the best general, or the bravest man, the world ever saw. England has produced a better general, France 2 or 3, both countries many braver men. The son of the Norfolk clergyman was a brave man, 392 Marshal Ney was a braver man. Oh, that battle of Copenhagen! Oh, that covering the retreat of the Grand Army! And though he said in 32 that he could write, he is not going to say in 54 that he is the best of all military writers. On the contrary, he does not hesitate to say that any commentary of Julius Caesar, or any chapter in Justinus, more especially the one about the Parthians, is worth the 10 volumes of Wellington's dispatches. Though he has no doubt that, by saying so, he shall especially rouse the indignation of a certain newspaper. At present one of the most genteel journals imaginable, with a slight tendency to liberalism, it is true, but perfectly genteel, which is nevertheless the very one which, in 32, swore bodily that Wellington could neither read nor write and devised an ingenious plan for teaching him how to read. Now, after the above statement, no one will venture to say, if the writer should be disposed to bear hard upon radicals, that he would be influenced by a desire to pay court to princes, or to curry favor with Tories, or from being a blind admirer of the Duke of Wellington. But the writer is not going to declaim against radicals, that is, real Republicans, or their principles. Upon the whole, he is something of an admirer of both. The writer has always had as much admiration for everything that is real and honest as he has had contempt for the opposite. Now real republicanism is certainly a very fine thing, a much finer thing than Toryism, a system of common robbery, which is nevertheless far better than Whiggism 393, a compound of petty larceny, popular instruction, and receiving of stolen goods. Yes, real republicanism is certainly a very fine thing, and your real radicals and republicans are certainly very fine fellows, or rather were fine fellows. For the Lord only knows where to find them at the present day, the writer does not. If he did, he would at any time go 5 miles to invite one of them to dinner, even supposing that he had to go to a workhouse in order to find the person he wished to invite. Amongst the real radicals of England, those who flourished from the year 16 to 20, there were certainly extraordinary characters, men partially insane, perhaps. But honest and brave, they did not make a market of the principles which they professed, and never intended to do so. They believed in them, and were willing to risk their lives in endeavoring to carry them out. The writer wishes to speak in particular of 2 of these men, both of whom perished on the scaffold. Their names were Thistlewood and Ings. 394 Thistlewood, the best known of them, was a brave soldier and had served with distinction as an officer in the French service. He was one of the excellent swordsmen of Europe. Had fought several duels in France, where it is no child's play to fight a duel. But had never unsheathed his sword for single combat, but in defense of the feeble and insulted. He was kind and open-hearted, but of too great simplicity. He had once £10,000 left him, all of which he lent to a friend, who disappeared and never returned him a penny. Ings was an uneducated man, of very low stature, but amazing strength and resolution. He was a kind husband and father, and though a humble butcher, the name he bore was one of the royal names of the heathen Anglo-Saxons. These 2 men, along with 5 others, were executed, and their heads hacked off, for levying war against George IV. The whole 7 dying in a manner which extorted cheers from the populace, the most of them uttering philosophical or patriotic sayings. Thistlewood, who was, perhaps, the most calm and collected of all, just before he was turned off, said, "We are now going to discover the great secret." Ings, the moment before he was choked, was singing, "Scots wha hae why Wallace bled." Now there was no humbug about those men, nor about many more of the same time and of the same principles. They might be deluded about republicanism, as Algernon Sidney was, and as Brutus was, but they were as honest and brave as either Brutus or Sidney, and as willing to die for their principles. But the radicals who succeeded them were beings of a very different description. They jobbed and traded in republicanism, and either parted with it, or at the present day are eager to part with it, for a consideration. In order to get the Whigs into power, and themselves places, they brought the country by their inflammatory language to the verge of a revolution. And were the cause that many perished on the scaffold. By their incendiary harangues and newspaper articles they caused the Bristol conflagration, for which 6 poor creatures were executed. They encouraged the mob to pillage, pull down and burn, and then rushing into garrets looked on. Thistlewood tells the mob the Tower is a second Bastille, let it be pulled down. A mob tries to pull down the Tower, but Thistlewood is at the head of that mob. He is not peeping from a garret on Tower Hill like Gulliver at Lisbon. Thistlewood and Ings say to 20 ragged individuals, "Liverpool and Castlereagh are 2 satellites of despotism, it would be highly desirable to put them out of the way." And a certain number of ragged individuals are surprised in a stable in Cato Street, making preparations to put Castlereagh and Liverpool out of the way. And are fired upon with muskets by grenadiers, and are hacked at with cutlasses by Bow Street runners. But the twain who encouraged those ragged individuals to meet in Cato Street are not far off, they are not on the other side of the river, in the Borough, for example. In some garret or obscure cellar. The very first to confront the guards and runners are Thistlewood and Ings. Thistlewood whips his long thin rapier through Smithers' lungs, and Ings makes a dash at Fitzclarence with his butcher's knife. Oh, there was something in those fellows. Honesty and courage. But can as much be said for the inciters of the troubles of '32? No. They egged on poor ignorant mechanics and rustics, and got them hanged for pulling down and burning. Whilst the highest pitch to which their own daring ever mounted was to mob Wellington as he passed in the streets. Now, these people were humbugs, which Thistlewood and Ings were not. They raved and foamed against kings, queens, Wellington, the aristocracy, and what not, till they had got the Whigs into power, with whom they were in secret alliance, and with whom they afterwards openly joined in a system of robbery and corruption, more flagitious than the old Tory one, because there was more cant about it. For themselves they got consulships, commissionerships, and in some instances governments, for their sons clerkships in public offices. And there you may see those sons with the never-failing badge of the low scoundrel puppy, the gilt chain at the waistcoat pocket. And there you may hear and see them using the languishing tones, and employing the airs and graces which wenches use and employ, who, without being in the family way, wish to make their keepers believe that they are in the family way. Assuredly great is the cleverness of your radicals of 32, in providing for themselves and their families. Yet, clever as they are, there is one thing they cannot do: they get governments for themselves, commissionerships for their brothers, clerkships for their sons. But there is one thing beyond their craft: they cannot get husbands for their daughters, who, too ugly for marriage, and with their heads filled with the nonsense they have imbibed from gentility novels, go over from Socinus to the Pope, becoming sisters in fusty convents, or having heard a few sermons in Mr. Platitude's chapelle, seek for admission at the establishment of Mother S., who, after employing them for a time in various menial offices, and making them pluck off their eyebrows, hair by hair, generally dismisses them on the plea of sluttishness. Whereupon they return to their papas to eat the bread of the country, with the comfortable prospect of eating it still in the shape of a pension after their sires are dead. Papa, ex uno dis omnes, living as quietly as he can. Not exactly enviably, it is true, being now and then seen to cast an uneasy and furtive glance behind, even as an animal is wont, who has lost by some mischance a very sightly appendage. As quietly however as he can, and as dignifiedly, a great admirer of every genteel thing and genteel personage, the Duke in particular, whose dispatches, bound in red morocco, you will find on his table. A disliker of coarse expressions, and extremes of every kind, with a perfect horror for revolutions and attempts to revolutionize, exclaiming now and then, as a shriek escapes from whipped and bleeding Hungary, a groan from gasping Poland, and a half-stifled curse from downtrodden but scowling Italy, confound the revolutionary canaille. Why can't it be quiet? In a word, putting one in mind of the parvenu in the Walpurgis Nacht. The writer is no admirer of Goethe, but the idea of that parvenu was certainly a good one, yes, putting one in mind of the individual who says, "Wer waren Warlich auch nicht dumm. Und the 10 oft was were nicht Sultan. Doch jetzo kurt sich alles und und eben de wers fester halten wollten." We were no fools, as everyone discerned, and stopped at not our projects in fulfilling. But now the world seems topsy-turvy turned. To keep it quiet just when we were willing. Now, this class of individuals entertain a mortal hatred for Lavengro and its writer, and never lose an opportunity of vituperating both. It is true that such hatred is by no means surprising. There is certainly a great deal of difference between Lavengro and their own sons. The one thinking of independence and philology, whilst he is clinking away at kettles, and hammering horseshoes in dingles. The others stuck up at public offices with gilt chains at their waistcoat pockets, and giving themselves the airs and graces of females of a certain description. And there certainly is a great deal of difference between the author of Lavengro and themselves, he retaining his principles and his brush. They with scarlet breeches on, it is true, but without their republicanism and their tails. Oh, the writer can well afford to be vituperated by your pseudo-radicals of 32. Some time ago the writer was set upon by an old radical and his wife, but the matter is too rich not to require a chapter to itself. Chapter 11. The Old Radical 395. This very dirty man, with his very dirty face, would do any dirty act, which would get him a place. Some time ago the writer was set upon by an old radical and his wife. But before he relates the manner in which they set upon him, it will be as well to enter upon a few particulars tending to elucidate their reasons for so doing. The writer had just entered into his 18th year, when he met at the table of a certain Anglo-Germanist an individual, apparently somewhat under 30, of middle stature. A thin and weaselly figure, a sallow complexion, a certain obliquity of vision, and a large pair of spectacles. This person, who had lately come from abroad, and had published a volume of translations 396, had attracted some slight notice in the literary world, and was looked upon as a kind of lion in a small provincial capital. After dinner he argued a great deal, spoke vehemently against the church, and uttered the most desperate radicalism that was perhaps ever heard, saying he hoped that in a short time there would not be a king or queen in Europe, and inveighing bitterly against the English aristocracy, and against the Duke of Wellington in particular, whom he said, if he himself was ever president of an English republic, an event which he seemed to think by no means improbable, he would hang for certain infamous acts of profligacy and bloodshed which he had perpetrated in Spain. Being informed that the writer was something of a philologist, to which character the individual in question laid great pretensions, he came and sat down by him, and talked about languages and literature. The writer, who was only a boy, was a little frightened at first, but, not wishing to appear a child of absolute ignorance, he summoned what little learning he had, and began to blunder out something about the Celtic languages and their literature, and asked the lion who he conceived Finn Macaul to be, and whether he did not consider the Ode to the Fox, by Red Rees of Airy 397 to be a masterpiece of pleasantry. Receiving no answer to these questions from the lion, who, singular enough, would frequently, when the writer put a question to him, look across the table, and flatly contradict someone who was talking to some other person, the writer dropped the Celtic languages and literature, and asked him whether he did not think it a funny thing that Temujin, generally called Genghis Khan, should have married the daughter of Prester John. 398. The lion, after giving a side glance at the writer through his left spectacle glass, seemed about to reply, but was unfortunately prevented, being seized with an irresistible impulse to contradict a respectable doctor of medicine 399 who was engaged in conversation with the master of the house at the upper and farther end of the table. The writer being a poor ignorant lad, sitting of course at the bottom. The doctor, who had served in the peninsula, having observed that Ferdinand VII was not quite so bad as had been represented, the lion vociferated that he was 10 times worse, and that he hoped to see him and the Duke of Wellington hang together. The doctor, who, being a Welshman, was somewhat of a warm temper, growing rather red, said that at any rate he had been informed that Ferdinand VII knew sometimes how to behave himself like a gentleman. This brought on a long dispute, which terminated rather abruptly. The lion having observed that the doctor must not talk about Spanish matters with one who had visited every part of Spain, the doctor bowed, and said he was right, for that he believed no people in general possessed such accurate information about countries as those who had travelled them as bagmen. On the lion asking the doctor what he meant, the Welshman, whose under jaw began to move violently, replied, that he meant what he said. Here the matter ended, for the lion turning from him, looked at the writer. The writer, imagining that his own conversation hitherto had been too trivial and commonplace for the lion to consider it worth his while to take much notice of it, determined to assume a little higher ground, and after repeating a few verses of the Koran, and gabbling a little Arabic, asked the lion what he considered to be the difference between the Hijra and the Christian era, adding, that he thought the general computation was in error by about 1 year. And being a particularly modest person, chiefly, he believes, owing to his having been at school in Ireland, absolutely blushed at finding that the lion returned not a word in answer. What a wonderful individual I am seated by, thought he, to whom Arabic seems a vulgar speech, and a question about the Hijra not worthy of an answer. Not reflecting that as lions come from the Sahara, they have quite enough of Arabic at home, and that the question about the Hijra was rather malapropos to one used to prey on the flesh of Hajis. Now I only wish he would vouchsafe me a little of his learning, thought the boy to himself, and in this wish he was at last gratified. For the lion, after asking him whether he was acquainted at all with the Sclavonian languages, and being informed that he was not, absolutely dumbfounded him by a display of Sclavonian erudition. Years rolled by, the writer was a good deal about, sometimes in London, sometimes in the country, sometimes abroad. In London he occasionally met the man of the spectacles, who was always very civil to him, and, indeed, cultivated his acquaintance. The writer thought it rather odd that, after he himself had become acquainted with the Sclavonian languages and literature, the man of the spectacles talked little or nothing about them. In a little time, however, the matter ceased to cause him the slightest surprise, for he had discovered a key to the mystery. In the meantime the man of spectacles was busy enough. He speculated in commerce, failed, and paid his creditors 20 pennies in the pound, published translations, of which the public at length became heartily tired. Having, indeed, got an inkling of the manner in which those translations were got up, he managed, however, to ride out many a storm, having one trusty sheet anchor, radicalism. This he turned to the best advantage, writing pamphlets and articles in reviews, all in the radical interest, and for which he was paid out of the radical fund. Which articles and pamphlets, when Toryism seemed to reel on its last legs, exhibited a slight tendency to Whiggism. Nevertheless, his abhorrence of desertion of principle was so great in the time of the Duke of Wellington's administration, that when S. left the Whigs and went over, he told the writer, who was about that time engaged with him in a literary undertaking, that the said S. was a fellow with a character so infamous, that any honest man would rather that you should spit in his face than insult his ears with the mention of the name of S. 400. The literary project 401 having come to nothing, in which, by the by, the writer was to have all the labor, and his friend all the credit. Provided any credit should accrue from it, the writer did not see the latter for some years, during which time considerable political changes took place. The Tories were driven from, and the Whigs placed in, office, both events being brought about by the Radicals coalescing with the Whigs, over whom they possessed great influence for the services which they had rendered. When the writer next visited his friend, he found him very much altered. His opinions were by no means so exalted as they had been. He was not disposed even to be rancorous against the Duke of Wellington, saying that there were worse men than he, and giving him some credit as a general. A hankering after gentility seeming to pervade the whole family, father and sons, wife and daughters, all of whom talked about genteel diversions, gentility novels, and even seemed to look with favor on high churchism, having in former years, to all appearance, been bigoted dissenters. In a little time the writer went abroad, as, indeed, did his friend. Not, however, like the writer, at his own expense, but at that of the country, the Whigs having given him a travelling appointment, which he held for some years, during which he is said to have received upwards of £12,000 of the money of the country, for services which will, perhaps, be found inscribed on certain tablets, when another Astolfo shall visit the moon. For to this appointment, however, he lost on the Tories resuming power, when the writer found him almost as radical and patriotic as ever, just engaged in trying to get into Parliament, into which he got by the assistance of his radical friends, who, in conjunction with the Whigs, were just getting up a crusade against the Tories, which they intended should be a conclusive one. A little time after the publication of the Bible in Spain, the Tories being still in power, this individual, full of the most disinterested friendship for the author, was particularly anxious that he should be presented with an official situation, in a certain region a great many miles off. "You are the only person for that appointment," said he. "You understand a great deal about the country, and are better acquainted with the two languages spoken there than anyone in England. Now I love my country, and have, moreover, a great regard for you, and as I am in Parliament, and have frequent opportunities of speaking to the ministry, I shall take care to tell them how desirable it would be to secure your services. It is true they are Tories, but I think that even Tories would give up their habitual love of jobbery in a case like yours, and for once show themselves disposed to be honest men and gentlemen. Indeed, I have no doubt they will. For, having so deservedly an infamous character, they would be glad to get themselves a little credit, by a presentation which could not possibly be traced to jobbery or favoritism. The writer begged his friend to give himself no trouble about the matter, as he was not desirous of the appointment, being intolerably easy circumstances, and willing to take some rest after a life of labor. All, however, that he could say was of no use, his friend indignantly observing that the matter ought to be taken entirely out of his hands, and the appointment thrust upon him for the credit of the country. "But may not many people be far more worthy of the appointment than myself?" said the writer. "Where?" said the friendly radical. "If you don't get it, it will be made a job of, given to the son of some steward, or, perhaps, to some quack who has done dirty work. I tell you what, I shall ask it for you, in spite of you. I shall, indeed," and his eyes flashed with friendly and patriotic fervor through the large pair of spectacles which he wore. And, in fact, it would appear that the honest and friendly patriot put his threat into execution. "I have spoken," said he, "more than once to this and that individual in Parliament, and everybody seems to think that the appointment should be given to you. Nay, that you should be forced to accept it. I intend next to speak to Lord 403, and so he did, at least it would appear so." On the writer calling upon him one evening, about a week afterwards, in order to take leave of him, as the writer was about to take a long journey for the sake of his health, his friend no sooner saw him than he started up in a violent fit of agitation, and glancing about the room, in which there were several people, amongst others 2 Whig members of Parliament, said, "I am glad you are come, I was just speaking about you. This," said he, addressing the 2 members, "is so-and-so, the author of so-and-so, the well-known philologist. As I was telling you, I spoke to Lord 404 this day about him, and said that he ought forthwith to have the head appointment in 405, and what did the fellow say? Why, that there was no necessity for such an appointment at all, and if there were, why, and then he hummed and hawed. Yes," said he, looking at the writer, "he did indeed. What a scandal! What an infamy! But I see how it will be a job. The place will be given to some son of a steward or to some quack, as I said before. Oh, these Tories! Well, if this does not make one," here he stopped short, crunched his teeth, and looked the image of desperation. Seeing the poor man in this distressed condition, the writer begged him to be comforted, and not to take the matter so much to heart. But the indignant radical took the matter very much to heart, and refused all comfort whatever, bouncing about the room, and, whilst his spectacles flashed in the light of 4 spermaceti candles, exclaiming, "It will be a job, a Tory job. I see it all, I see it all, I see it all." And a job it proved, and a very pretty job, but no Tory job. Shortly afterwards the Tories were out, and the Whigs were in. From that time the writer heard not a word about the injustice done to the country, in not presenting him with the appointment to 406. The radical, however, was busy enough to obtain the appointment, not for the writer, but for himself, and eventually succeeded, partly through radical influence, and partly through that of a certain Whig lord, for whom the radical had done, on a particular occasion, work of a particular kind. So, though the place was given to a quack, and the whole affair a very pretty job, it was one in which the Tories had certainly no hand. In the meanwhile, however, the friendly radical did not drop the writer. Oh, no. On various occasions he obtained from the writer all the information about the country in question, and was particularly anxious to obtain from the writer, and eventually did obtain, a copy of a work written in the court language of that country, 407, edited by the writer, a language exceedingly difficult, which the writer, at the expense of a considerable portion of his eyesight, had acquired, at least as far as by the eyesight it could be acquired. What use the writer's friend made of the knowledge he had gained from him, and what use he made of the book, the writer can only guess. But he has little doubt that when the question of sending a person to was mooted in a parliamentary committee, which it was at the instigation of the radical supporters of the writer's friend, the radical, on being examined about the country, gave the information which he had obtained from the writer as his own, and flashed the book and its singular characters in the eyes of the committee. And then of course his radical friends would instantly say, "This is the man. There is no one like him." See what information he possesses. And see that book written by himself in the court language of Serendib.408. This is the only man to send there. What a glory, what a triumph it would be to Britain, to send out a man so deeply versed in the mysterious lore of, as our illustrious countryman. A person who with his knowledge could beat with their own weapons the wise men of. Is such an opportunity to be lost? Oh, no, surely not. If it is, it will be an eternal disgrace to England, and the world will see that Whigs are no better than Tories. Let no one think the writer uncharitable in these suppositions. The writer is only too well acquainted with the antecedents of the individual, to entertain much doubt that he would shrink from any such conduct, provided he thought that his temporal interest would be forwarded by it. The writer is aware of more than one instance in which he has passed off the literature of friendless young men for his own, after making them a slight pecuniary compensation and deforming what was originally excellent by interpolations of his own. This was his especial practice with regard to translation, of which he would fain be esteemed the king. This radical literato is slightly acquainted with 4 or 5 of the easier dialects of Europe, on the strength of which knowledge he would fain pass for a universal linguist, publishing translations of pieces originally written in various difficult languages, which translations, however, were either made by himself from literal renderings done for him into French or German, or had been made from the originals into English, by friendless young men, and then deformed by his alterations. Well, the radical got the appointment, and the writer certainly did not grudge it him. He, of course, was aware that his friend had behaved in a very base manner towards him, but he bore him no ill will, and invariably when he heard him spoken against, which was frequently the case, took his part when no other person would. Indeed, he could well afford to bear him no ill will. He had never sought for the appointment, nor wished for it, nor, indeed, ever believed himself to be qualified for it. He was conscious, it is true, that he was not altogether unacquainted with the language and literature of the country with which the appointment was connected. He was likewise aware that he was not altogether deficient in courage and in propriety of behavior. He knew that his appearance was not particularly against him, his face not being like that of a convicted pickpocket, nor his gait resembling that of a fox who has lost his tail. Yet he never believed himself adapted for the appointment, being aware that he had no aptitude for the doing of dirty work, if called to do it, nor pliancy which would enable him to submit to scurvy treatment, whether he did dirty work or not, requisites, at the time of which he is speaking, indispensable in every British official. Requisites, by the by, which his friend, the radical, possessed in a high degree, but though he bore no ill will towards his friend bore anything but good will towards him. For from the moment that he had obtained the appointment for himself, his mind was filled with the most bitter malignity against the writer, and naturally enough. For no one ever yet behaved in a base manner towards another, without forthwith conceiving a mortal hatred against him. You wrong another, know yourself to have acted basely, and are enraged, not against yourself, for no one hates himself, but against the innocent cause of your baseness. Reasoning very plausibly, but for that fellow, I should never have been base, for had he not existed, I could not have been so, at any rate against him. And this hatred is all the more bitter, when you reflect that you have been needlessly base. Whilst the Tories are in power, the writer's friend, of his own accord, raves against the Tories because they do not give the writer a certain appointment, and makes, or says he makes, desperate exertions to make them do so. But no sooner are the Tories out, with whom he has no influence, and the Whigs in, with whom he, or rather his party, has influence, than he gets the place for himself, though, according to his own expressed opinion, an opinion with which the writer does not, and never did, concur, the writer was the only person competent to hold it. Now had he, without saying a word to the writer, or about the writer with respect to the employment, got the place for himself when he had an opportunity, knowing, as he very well knew, himself to be utterly unqualified for it, the transaction, though a piece of jobbery, would not have merited the title of a base transaction. As the matter stands, however, who can avoid calling the whole affair not only a piece of, come, out with the word, scoundrelism on the part of the writer's friend, but a most curious piece of uncalled for scoundrelism? And who, with any knowledge of fallen human nature, can wonder at the writer's friend entertaining towards him a considerable portion of gall and malignity? This feeling on the part of the writer's friend was wonderfully increased by the appearance of Lavengro. Many passages of which the radical in his foreign appointment applied to himself and family, one or two of his children having gone over to popery, the rest become members of Mr. Platitude's chapel, and the minds of all being filled with ultra notions of gentility. The writer, hearing that his old friend had returned to England, to apply, he believes, for an increase of salary, and for a title, called upon him, unwillingly, it is true. For he had no wish to see a person for whom, though he bore him no ill will, he could not avoid feeling a considerable portion of contempt. The truth is, that his sole object in calling was to endeavor to get back a piece of literary property which his friend had obtained from him many years previously, and which, though he had frequently applied for it, he never could get back. Well, the writer called. He did not get his property, which, indeed, he had scarcely time to press for, being almost instantly attacked by his good friend and his wife, yes. It was then that the author was set upon by an old radical, and his wife, the wife, who looked the very image of shame and malignity, did not say much, it is true, but encouraged her husband in all he said. Both of their own accord introduced the subject of Lavengro. The radical called the writer a grumbler, just as if there had ever been a greater grumbler than himself until, by the means above described, he had obtained a place. He said that the book contained a melancholy view of human nature, just as if anybody could look in his face without having a melancholy view of human nature. On the writer quietly observing that the book contained an exposition of his principles, the pseudo-radical replied, that he cared nothing for his principles, which was probably true. It not being likely that he would care for another person's principles after having shown so thorough a disregard for his own. The writer said that the book, of course, would give offense to humbugs. The radical then demanded whether he thought him a humbug. The wretched wife was the radical's protection, even as he knew she would be. It was on her account that the writer did not kick his good friend. As it was, he looked at him in the face and thought to himself, how is it possible I should think you a humbug, when only last night I was taking your part in a company in which everybody called you a humbug? The radical, probably observing something in the writer's eye which he did not like, became all on a sudden abjectly submissive, and, professing the highest admiration for the writer, begged him to visit him in his government. This the writer promised faithfully to do, and he takes the present opportunity of performing his promise. This is one of the pseudo-radical calumniators of Lavengro and its author. Were the writer on his deathbed, he would lay his hand on his heart and say, that he does not believe that there is one trait of exaggeration in the portrait which he has drawn. This is one of the pseudo-radical calumniators of Lavengro and its author. And this is one of the genus, who, after having railed against jobbery for perhaps a quarter of a century, at present batten on large official salaries which they do not earn. England is a great country, and her interests require that she should have many a well-paid official both at home and abroad. But will England long continue a great country if the care of her interests, both at home and abroad, is in many instances entrusted to beings like him described above, whose only recommendation for an official appointment was that he was deeply versed in the secrets of his party and of the Whigs? Before he concludes, the writer will take the liberty of saying of Lavengro that it is a book written for the express purpose of inculcating virtue, love of country, learning, manly pursuits, and genuine religion, for example, that of the Church of England, and for awakening a contempt for nonsense of every kind, and a hatred for priestcraft, more especially that of Rome. And in conclusion, with respect to many passages of his book in which he has expressed himself in terms neither measured nor mealy, he will beg leave to observe, in the words of a great poet, who lived a profligate life, it is true, but who died a sincere penitent, thanks, after God, to good Bishop Burnet. All this with indignation I have hurled. At the pretending part of this proud world. Who, swollen with selfish vanity, devise false freedoms, formal cheats, and holy lies, over their fellow fools to tyrannize. Rochester. Complete list of English gypsy words scattered through Lavengro and Romany rye. Common European gypsy forms are in parenthesis. Abri. Avri, out, forth. Otter/adre. Andre, in, into. Ambrol. A pair. Andy. In, into. Angar. Charcoal, coal. Apoply. Again, once more. Ava/Avali. Yes. Avella. Third singular of Aviva, he comes, Gorgio Avella, someone is coming. Aviva, Avesa, Avila. Beluva. Below, pork. Below. Hog. Barrow. Feminine bari, plural bear, big, great. Batu. Father. Ballo. See below. Baller. Plural of below, swine. Bebby. Bibi, aunt. In George Borrow grandmother, with and without grand. Bung. Toad, dragon, devil. Bengui. Spanish gypsy bengi, IQ bung. Besh. Bishava, to sit. Beatty. A little, a bit of. Bichity. Bichavd, plural of bichavdo, sent. With paudel, transported. Bokt. Bucked, fate, luck, fortune. Burrow. See, barrow. Borodromengro. Highwayman. Bosham. Bashava, I sing or play, violin, fiddle. Bashamengro. Fiddler. Bovelo. Barvelo, rich. Butte. But, much. Butte Dosta, a good many, plenty of. Coffee. Kappa Alpha Rhophi, horseshoe nail. Caloro/calori. A Spanish gypsy. Diminutive of callo, see callo. Cambry. Camney, with child. Camamescro. From Kamama, I love, a Lovell, gypsy tribe name. Kana. Kanna, when. Collar. Color, plural shillings. Chabe. Plural of chabwa. Chabwa. Chavo, child, lad, gypsy. Chachapan. Chachap, truth. Chal. Noun, chabel or chavel, still existant in Spain, lad, gypsy. Romany chal, gypsy. Romany chi, gypsy, lass. Verb, for jal, from Java. Chal devlahai, ja devlisa, go with God, farewell. Chavo. Iq chabwa. Chi. Che, girl, lass, child, gypsy. Chibando. Spanish gypsy, see chive, tossing, preaching, a sermon. Chick. Chick, dirt, mud. Chia. Iq chi. Chickno. Tickno, a youth. Tano chickno, shorty. China mescro. From Chinava, I cut, chisel, parer. Chipe. Chip, tongue. Chive. Chivava, to throw, to pass, false coin. Chivios. Is cast, he. Chong. Tumba, hill. Chongav, Norwich, town of the Castle Hill. Choomer. Chummy, a kiss. Chor. Tkarava, to steal. Cories. Thieves. Shovahani. Chovakani, a witch. Shovahano. Chovacano, a wizard. Churi. Tkori, knife. Coin. Khan, who? Coco. Keiko, uncle. Calico. Calico, Spanish Gypsy calicast, on the morrow, in the morning, bs early, is a mistake. Core. Corava, I strike, to hammer. Cooromengro. Boxer. Covanza. Anvil. Kovar. Kova, thing. Kraul/Kralis. Crawleys, king. Cuckerin. Merely alliterative with duckerin. Curomengro. Boxer. Chigani. Hungarian, Gypsy, Zygan. Diargini. Hungarian, Dorog, thunder, Dorgini, to thunder, it thunders. Dick. Dicava, to see. Dinello. Danilo or Dinilo, a fool. Divas. Dives, day. Dluvu. Error for lovo. Duk. Noun, Slavic, spirit, soul, divining spirit, demon, ghost. Russian ducks. Verb, to spirit away, to bewitch. Dosta. Enough. Dov Odoi. From Odova, that there, up yonder. Drab. Noun, herb, drug, poison, see drow. Verb, to poison. Drabengro. Seller of medicines, apothecary. Drabengro cur, apothecary's shop. Dram. Deltaromuomicron, road, way. Drow. IQ drab, often plural drugs, poison. DUI. 2. Duck. Baros duk. Ducker. From duck, spirit or demon, and cur, to make, to evoke, to tell anyone's fortune, to tell fortunes. Duckerin duk. The fortune-telling or divining spirit. Duckerin. The in is English ing, anyone's fortune or fortunes, fate, fortune-telling. To pen a duckerin is incorrect. Duckeripen. Fortune-telling. Dumo. Dumo, the back. Duvel. Devil, God. Duvelsko. Divlesko, divine. Die. Die, mother. Engro. A mere adjectival ending, ing, Barovian for master, fellow, chap. Erajai. Rashai, priest, in Spanish Gypsy. Erai. See Rai. Farmengro. Farmer. Fino. English fine. Foros. Phi-rho omicron equals gamma omicron rho, city, town. Gav. Village, town. Gil. To singular. Gilly. Gilly, song, ditty. Gitano. A.S.P. Gypsy. Gorgiki. Feminine of Gorgico. Gorgico. Feminine of Gorgio, non-gypsy. Gorgio. Gajo, non-gypsy, stranger, somebody, policeman. Gorgeous. Adjective formed from Gorgio. Grand BB. Grandmother. See Bebi. Grasny. Mare, jade. Grandini. From Romanian, it hails. Gry. Gray, horse. Pelangog, stallion. Gudlo/Gudley. Sweet, Gudlo-pesham, honeycomb. Ghoul erai. Hungarian G, sweet gentleman. Haben. Cabe, from Kavava, I eat, food, victuals, feast. Harkameskro. Arkichi, tin, tinker. Hatch. To cook, evidently from Pekava, rather than Achava. Hinjiri. Feminine of Hinjiro, from Janger, a chain, executioner. Hear me devlis. Or diblis, by G. Hakawar. Kakavava, to lie, to cheat. Hakaripen. Falsehood, deception. Or worth. Pennyworth. Or, from grosh. Uzia. Shuzo, clean. Jaw. Java, to go. Si chow. Jawing. Going. Jib. Chib, tongue, language. Juggal. Jukal, dog. Juva/Jua. Young, woman. Care. Si cur. Callow. Feminine Kali, plural kale, black, dark. Kali. Feminine of Kalo. Kalo. Si callow. Kalamescro. Blacksmith. Ku. Two. Kek. None. Kakabi/Kakavi. Kakavi, kettle. Kikavisco saster. Kettle iron or hook. Kekano. No, not one. Cur. Noun, house. Verb, karava, to make, to do. Kurdo. Made, he. Kill. Kalava, to play. Kin. Kinava, to buy. Kister. Klasava, to ride. Kichima. Tavern, alehouse. Kosko. Good. Kral/Kralis. King, si kral. Lachapan. Goodness. Laki/Lakey. Lake, her, to her. Lavengro. Wordmaster, philologist. Lel. Lava, Lisa, Lela, to take, to buy. Len. IQ lenda. Lenda. There, to them. Lest. Him. Laviner. Lavina, ale. Chapter Lil. Paper, book. Leary. Law. Lease. It. Lalo. Lolo, red. Luvu. See. Lovo. Coin, plural love, money. Lubany. Lubny, harlot. Lundra. London. Lurapen. Theft, robbery. Mila. Donkey. Man. Me. Monday. To me. Mang. Mangava, to beg. Manrikli. Manriklo, cake. Manro. Bread. Manus. Manish, man. Merrill. Error for Merrill Mareva, Marisa, Marila, he dies. Mech. Mukava, to leave, to let, mech lease, drop it. Men. We. Mensar. Mensa, with us. Mer. Mareva, to die. Me. I. Medivalesco Lil. Divine or godly book. Miro. Mine. Myri. Miri, my. Moro. Bread. Muchtar. Mukhtar, box, toolbox. Mullo. Mulo, dead. Nashkado/Nashkadi. Nashavdo, lost, ruined, hanged, George Barrow. Nashki. Gallows, George Barrow. Nav. Name. O. The. Odoi/Odoi. There, here. Upper. On, upon, up. Pa. Over, for. Pal. Prawl, brother, friend, mate. Paler. Prala, brothers. Paraco. Paracro, zinc. Paraco, I thank. Patteran. Patron, leaf of a tree, gypsy trail. Podel. Purdle, on the other side, across. Palengo. Palengro, from Pele, testicles, with gry, a stallion. Pen. Penava, to say, to tell. Pashota. Plural of peshit, bellows. Petal. Petalo, horseshoe. Pechalengro. Head of the clan, smith. Pindro. Pinro, foot, hoof. Pios. From piava, I drink, health, in toasting. Pyramus. Ms. Priamus. Plaistra. Clashta, pincers, tongs. Plastramengro. Runner, detective. Pagado/Pagadi. Pangiardo, broken. Paknes. Paknes, a man of trust, magistrate. Prala. Vocative of pal or pral, brother. Pre. Upper, on, upon. Pudamengro. From Purdava or Pudava, I blow, bellows. Puro. Feminine puri, plural pure, old, ancient. Pus. Straw. Puv. Or fuv, earth, ground. Ran. Stick, rod, cane. Rani. Lady, wife. Rard. Rat, night. Rat. Rate and Rithi, blood, race. Rani. See Rani. Rig. To carry. Rin. A file. Rinkino. I, pretty, fine. Ram. Husband, gypsy. Roman. Barovian tour gypsy. Romanescoines. In gypsy fashion. Romanes. Gypsies. Romanly. In gypsy, gypsy-like. Romano. I, gypsy. Romany chal. Gypsy. Romany chi. Gypsy, girl. Romany rye. Gypsy gentleman. Romany. Anglicized form of Romano, Romany, gypsy. Rome Andre. Ram Andre. Gypsy at heart. Romy. Wife. Romanes. In gypsy, also wife, George Borrow. Romany. IQ Romany. Rove. Third person singular of Rovava, he weeps. Roop. Silver. Rye. Rye, gentleman. Sanpriel. Sansparel. Sap. Snake. Sapengro. Snake catcher. Sar Shan. How art thou? SAS. It was, were it. Saster/Sastra. Iron. Sastramescro. Worker in iron, smith. Solo. Mess. Sorlo, morning, early. Savo. What kind of a man? Who? Scopolo. Ninny. Say. ISI, is, are. Shan. Ison, thou art. Sharengro. From Shiro, the head, headman, chief. Sham. Isam, I am. Shun. Shaneva, to hear, to listen. Shikaro. Chocano, hammer. Shanela. Shanila, third singular of Shaneva, is listening. C. ISI, is, are, SI men, are we, SI mensar, mensa, is or are with us. Sanaba. Spanish gypsy, was. Sore. Ser, plural all who. SOS. Verb, ices, was. Pronoun, who. Sov. Sovava, to sleep. Sweetie. Plural of Russian sviat, people, folks. Sinfi. Cynthia, Slavic th is pronounced ph. Ta. And. Tacho. I, true. Tan. Place, tent. Tassaler. Read Tassorlo, tomorrow. Tachino. I, modest, chaste. Tachipan. Truth. Tawny. Feminine of. Tawno/tawny. Tarno, little, short. Tove. Tavava, to wash. Trin. 3. Truppo. Truppo, body. 2. Thou. Toot. Tut, thee, to thy. Vajesco. Adjective of yag. Vasavi. Feminine of. Vasavo. Vile. Villamini. Hungarian villam, it lightens. Wafodo. Bad, raise. Wel. Corrupted from avella, to come, to go. Welling. Coming. Wendrer. Connected with andro, within, the insides. Wsh. Vesh, forest. Wust. To throw, better the first ms form, chiv. Yag. Fire. Ye. The. Yek. Yek, 1. Yav. Ov, b. Zjuner. Jar, gypsy. Zingaro. It, gypsy.